What would you do if the people you gave everything to, your time, your youth, your identity, looked straight through you like you weren't even there? That's where Eleanor's story begins. Not with a dramatic betrayal, not with a screaming match, just a quiet Tuesday morning, a Bluetooth earpiece glowing blue, and the realization that her husband hadn't heard a single word she had said in 5 years. So she handed him the divorce papers, and he signed them, still on his call, without blinking. But this isn't a sad story. This is the story of a woman who drove a red convertible into the open road, who moved to Finland, who learned 5 languages, who stood in the snow one night with her ex-husband on the other side of the door and chose, again, herself. Eleanor's journey asks us a question we should all sit with. How much of yourself have you quietly handed away to a relationship, a role, a title, hoping someone would finally notice? Because the person who needed to notice was always you. If this story moves you, tell us why in the comments. Share it with someone you love. Like the video and subscribe, so every story we tell finds its way to the people who need it most. This content was manually researched, built, and edited by our team to bring you meaning and a lesson worth keeping.
When Brandon first sat in my office, the story of his marriage's end didn't begin with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a multi-million-dollar deal closing. He described the morning with a chilling detachment, recounting how he'd paced by a 15-foot marble table while his wife, Stephanie, sat on the other side. He remembered gesturing vaguely toward some documents she'd placed there, his mind 1,000 miles away, his voice calibrated for the investors on his earpiece. He told me, "I remember thinking about what Eric said. If he really needed Jessica Miller in his life, then I was done arguing. I told my associate I'd sign." He recalled launching into the terms of his business deal, a seamless monologue that had nothing to do with the woman sitting across from him. To him, it was just another Tuesday. "I told them she'd get full custody of Eric," he admitted to me later, the irony still lost on him. "I said I didn't need the assets, to just put it all in a trust for him. I saw it as my final word on the negotiation." He remembered Stephanie putting her coffee mug down with a sharp clink that briefly cut through his concentration. He could vaguely recall her asking, "Brandon, who are you talking to?" He never looked up. The blue light of his Bluetooth headset was the only thing he was connected to. He was closing a deal, completely oblivious that he was simultaneously liquidating his entire life. And just like that, the disconnect that had defined his marriage reached its peak. In our sessions, it became clear he genuinely hadn't registered her words. He had perfected the art of selective hearing, a defense mechanism that protected his high-pressure world from the inconvenient emotional needs of his family. For 5 years, Stephanie had been trying to get his attention, to be seen by the man she married. He admitted to me that he'd often come home smelling of Jessica's perfume, a scent he knew was recognizable to their entire social circle, but he'd rationalized it as an unfortunate but necessary consequence of his work. He recalled an evening when Stephanie had finally confronted him, her voice trembling as she asked, "Who is it you spend all your time with, Brandon?" He confessed to me that he'd given her his trademark polished smile, the one that secured funding and neutralized threats. "Just a colleague," he'd said, his attention already back on his tablet. He had become so detached, he barely recognized the woman sharing his home. But that morning, as he continued his phone call, he noticed a shift. She wasn't pleading anymore. When she flipped the document to the signature page and slid it back, her voice was cold steel. "Then sign it." I'm sure it won't take more than a minute of your valuable time, she'd said. It was the sarcasm, he told me, that finally made him end his call. The little blue light went dark. For the first time that morning, he actually focused on her, an unfamiliar irritation rising in him. But as his eyes fell to the paper, his son, Eric, came running into the room, a happy blur of motion. "Daddy, are you going golfing with Aunt Jessica? Can I come?" As Brandon started to get up, relieved by the interruption, Stephanie did something utterly alien. She slammed her hand down on his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong against the cold marble. "Sign." In that moment, he admitted, he truly saw her. The shock was visceral. The quiet, agreeable woman he had curated for his life wasn't supposed to have this kind of fire. But his programming was deep. Eric's voice, rising in an impatient whine, was a more urgent signal. "Daddy, let's go! You know Aunt Jessica gets mad and says you're too slow if you make her wait." His son's demand was the stimulus he was conditioned to respond to. "Okay, buddy, okay." And then came the moment that would eventually bring him to my office, a man hollowed out by regret. Without a single glance at the document that would formally end his marriage, Brandon Hayes grabbed a pen and scrawled his name. Just like that. In an instant, he and Eric were out the door. He told me he felt a brief flash of triumph, of having efficiently handled a minor domestic issue. He had no idea he was staring at his life in the rearview mirror, utterly blind to the horror of his own casual indifference and the crushing weight of what he'd just done. It was only when he returned that evening to a silent, cavernous apartment that the truth began to dawn. There, on the table, were the papers, his signature, arrogant and fluid, and next to it, hers, precise and final. In his entire life, the names Stephanie Vance and Brandon Hayes had appeared together on only two legal documents. One was a marriage license. The second was this declaration of ruin. As he stood there, he finally understood the single dark smudge on the page wasn't a flaw in the paper. It was the ghost of a tear. He walked numbly upstairs to their bedroom. Opening the doors to her walk-in closet felt like disturbing a tomb. It was half empty. The clothes that remained were a uniform for a life he'd forced upon her. Severe, formal, and punishingly expensive. Costumes for a role she had finally quit. In that empty space, he tried to remember the girl he'd met before she became Mrs. Hayes, the one who loved loud music and drove too fast. He realized with a sickening jolt that he had systematically sanded away every one of her interesting edges until she was a smooth, polished object that fit perfectly into his world. That's the core of what we worked through. He hadn't wanted a partner. He'd wanted a beautiful accessory, a soft-spoken placeholder who would complete the picture of his success. And after she had sacrificed every piece of her vibrant self to please him, he had never even attempted to see her, let alone love her. He began to remember the whispers at parties, which he'd always dismissed as jealousy. They called her a beautiful, empty doll. He was the one who had hollowed her out. Everyone knew Brandon Hayes and Jessica Miller were the real couple. Staring into that empty closet, the full, ugly truth washed over him, and a wave of nausea sent him running for the bathroom. He looked at his own reflection afterward, seeing not the titan of industry, but a man whose negligence was so profound it bordered on monstrous. Divorcing him, he finally understood, was the first decision Stephanie had made for herself since the day she had met him. It was an act of survival. He had to get her back. He had to fix it. He spent the next hour dialing her number, her best friend Megan's number, even her parents'. No one answered. Her family, he dimly recalled, had largely faded from their lives after the wedding. He had bought their daughter, and the transaction was complete. That sprawling penthouse, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a cage he had built for himself. There was no one to call. There was nowhere for him to go. Days later, clearing his phone's memory, he found it. The text message that was the final nail in the coffin of his ignorance. It was from Stephanie, sent a week before the signing. A hopeful, almost shy message about booking a table at their favorite restaurant for her birthday. His stomach dropped. It was her birthday. The day he had signed the papers, the day he took his son to celebrate with his mistress, had been his own wife's birthday. The message was still there, a digital ghost bearing the coldest of timestamps, unread. The casual cruelty of it was staggering. He remembered that night now with horrifying clarity. He'd gone to that very restaurant with Jessica and Eric. A slight like that would have once been unthinkable to him, a failure of his meticulous planning. But now, it was just one more piece of evidence in the case against himself. He remembered the pity in the host's eyes as they'd arrived. "Sir, I'm so sorry," the host had stammered. "There seems to have been a double booking." Brandon had cut him off, making a joke about buying the man's restaurant if he didn't find them a table. He remembered the host's flustered look as he'd glanced toward the door. Now, he realized with a certainty that chilled his blood, the host had been looking at Stephanie. He had arrived to celebrate his affair on the wreckage of his wife's own reservation. He replayed the scene in his mind, but this time it was a horror film. He saw himself presenting the cake to Jessica. He heard his own voice dripping with a tenderness Stephanie had never known from him, saying, "Happy birthday, Jessica. May all your wishes come true." And then he heard his own son's bright, innocent voice twisting the knife. "Happy birthday, Aunt Jessica. I hope you wish to marry Daddy and be my new mommy." Brandon could finally see himself as she must have seen him, a man so captivated by his affair that he was blind to everything else. And his son, the boy he was supposedly protecting, he had coached him. He had taught Eric to pull out Jessica's chair, to pour her water, to gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, molding his own son into an accomplice. In 5 years of marriage, he'd never remembered Stephanie's birthday. In his entire life, Eric had never once poured his mother a glass of water. Brandon had built a new family right in front of his real one, and he'd been too arrogant and self-absorbed to even notice. The rage he imagined her friend Megan must have felt was nothing compared to the self-loathing that was now consuming him. He finally understood Stephanie's last words to her friend that night. "I already signed the papers." It wasn't a statement of defeat. It was a declaration of freedom. It took months of therapy for Brandon to stop seeing himself as a victim of a shocking betrayal and start seeing himself as the architect of his own desolation. That woman he had called a manipulative monster was a person pushed to the absolute limit. He finally saw that for 5 years, Stephanie's entire world had been calibrated to orbit him and their son, and he had never once glanced in her direction. He began to remember the promising career she abandoned, the friends who slowly drifted away, the countless times he'd call her away from a rare outing with Megan to come home and fix him some special meal. He remembered the nights their son was a screaming infant, and how Stephanie would walk the halls with him for hours on end in the dark, specifically so his own sleep wouldn't be disturbed. She gave every single piece of herself to him, and he hadn't just taken it for granted. He had actively discarded it in favor of something new and easier. The pain was just beginning, but for the first time, Brandon Hayes was finally awake. As a counselor, you learn that silence is often louder than tears. When Brandon first told me about his wife, Stephanie, he couldn't understand her emotional distance. He'd recount how her friends would try to get her to open up about her sacrifices, and she would just retreat, saying she had no tears left. What he failed to see was that she had already shed them all in private, crying through the humiliating lessons from his mother, crying into her pillow when he was emotionally absent, and crying in the lonely hours past midnight, waiting for a husband who never came home. This wasn't coldness, it was emotional exhaustion, a self preservation response to years of quiet heartbreak. The breaking point for any system under pressure is often a single, sharp event. For Stephanie, it was the night their son, Liam, was burning up with a fever of 104. Brandon recounted her call to me, admitting he barely registered the panic in her voice before dismissing her with a clipped, "I'm busy." He didn't understand at the time that, with those two words, he had personally detonated the last vestiges of her hope. In that moment, she wasn't just a frantic mother. She was a woman realizing the institution she'd been sold. The Caldwell family was a corporation, and she had been nothing more than a 5-year acquisition that had failed to appreciate in value. I work with people in crisis, and often the crisis is a complete shattering of their reality. Brandon Caldwell came to me because his world had stopped making sense. He is a man governed by a lifetime of rigid routine. So when he called me, his voice was thick with a disorientation that went beyond a late night. He'd woken up and, on pure instinct, dialed Stephanie. "You won't believe it," he'd said, his voice a bewildered rasp. "I called to ask where my Monday Patek was." He described how she, without a single pause, had recited its location from memory, a ghost in his machine still running her old programs. "It's in the walk-in closet, top drawer of the island. Your matching cufflinks are in the tray right below it." For just a heartbeat, that seamless, automatic exchange made his universe feel whole again. The gears clicked back into place. Then, a profound, crushing silence on the other end of the line brought the new reality crashing in. She was gone. The divorce was real. It wasn't just that his watch was found. It was that the entire system that managed his existence had been unplugged. He wasn't mourning the loss of a wife. He was experiencing a profound system failure, a cognitive dissonance so jarring he told me it felt like navigating his own home with a phantom limb. He relayed to me what she said next, and I could hear the shift even in his retelling. Her voice, he said, became patient, the tone one might use for a confused child. "You should probably have your housekeeper reorganize your closet," she had suggested, setting a clear, calm boundary. "You can ask her for things from now on. We're divorced, Brandon. Do you remember?" That gentle question was devastating. He told me all he could do was grunt an affirmative before walking, like a drone, to the exact spot she'd indicated, finding everything in its perfect prescribed place. His mind, however, was still running on a decade of deeply ingrained programming. Just as he was about to hang up, a conditioned reflex took over. He barked an order into the phone, something about wanting his usual seafood chowder delivered to his office at Caldwell Tower for the next 2 days. Then he disconnected. It was a perfect illustration of his pathology. Her words, her absence, the legal reality of their divorce. None of it could penetrate the fortress of his entitlement. He was issuing commands into a void, completely unaware the operator had left the building. He learned the next part of the story later, after the fact. Stephanie, in a final act of self-preservation, had finally blocked his number. To be thorough, she even severed the line to their son Liam's preschool teacher. But In a family system as enmeshed as the Caldwells, you can't just block the primary number, you have to block the entire network. And she forgot the central server, his mother. As Stephanie attempted to find a moment of peace over a late lunch, she was intercepted by the matriarch, Eleanor Caldwell herself. Eleanor Caldwell, as Brandon described her, doesn't walk. She advances. She reportedly coerced Stephanie into her chauffeured car, and the moment the door sealed them in that leather-bound chamber, she threw a stack of glossy photos into Stephanie's lap. They were pictures of Brandon with another woman, Ashley. "Your failure is more profound than I can articulate," Eleanor began, her voice a weapon. "From the day you turned 16, I personally sculpted you into the perfect Caldwell wife." It was a chilling admission, framing a human being as a piece of art to be molded and displayed. The verbal assault was relentless, a masterclass in psychological demolition. "A decade!" Eleanor had hissed, dripping with contempt. "An entire decade has passed, and you still haven't managed to make my son love you. If I had known how useless you'd be, I would have chosen someone else." In a fit of rage, she'd hurled a small picture frame, its silver edge catching Stephanie's neck and drawing a thin line of blood. The true insanity is that when the Caldwells first chose her, she was the object of every girl's envy in their town. A textbook example of how a gilded cage can look like a fairy tale from the outside. But even from a distance, I knew that facade had to have cracks. From the moment she turned 16, Stephanie's life was no longer her own. It was a meticulously scheduled, endlessly scrutinized training program designed to produce Mrs. Brandon Caldwell. That kind of pressure doesn't just shape a person, it hollows them out. I recall hearing about her senior year, about a desperate public attempt to break free. She began dating another boy, loudly and visibly, hoping the rebellion would be enough to force Brandon to finally end their arranged engagement. But Brandon, as was his way, did nothing. He didn't have to. The family system simply absorbed the problem, deploying its resources silently and efficiently. Within a day, Stephanie was gone, exiled to a notoriously severe finishing school in the Swiss Alps. She was married to him for 5 years, but she was a prisoner of his family for 10, a full decade. So when I heard she finally met Eleanor's icy glare with a voice of pure steel and said, "I've already signed the divorce papers," I recognized it as a profound act of liberation. I am not seeking custody of our son, and I am not taking a single dollar. I am leaving with absolutely nothing. Can you imagine the power in that? She was performing a radical amputation. She was telling the matriarch, "Since I am such a disappointment, I am removing myself completely. Go find the daughter-in-law you truly want." But as she moved to leave, Eleanor lunged, her hand clamping around Stephanie's wrist like a vice. "Kayla, you wouldn't dare," she threatened, her crimson nails digging into skin, a desperate last-ditch effort to reassert control. But Stephanie simply turned, a slow, unsettling smile on her face. "Oh, there's nothing I wouldn't dare to do anymore," she replied, her voice soft but unbreakable. "That name, Mrs. Caldwell, it was never an honor. It was a life sentence." Then she pushed up her sleeve, and she showed her the scars. For the first time, the invisible pain that had defined her existence became visible. I was told Eleanor snatched her hand back as if burned, her eyes wide with shock at the sight of the pale raised lines that marked her skin. With that same ghostly smile, Stephanie gently traced one of the old scars. "I never, ever wanted to be your son's wife," she said, her voice a near whisper. "Whenever the pressure became too much, Whenever I felt like I couldn't breathe, this was the only thing that made me feel like I was still real. This is a classic, tragic response to severe depersonalization, a desperate attempt to ground oneself in physical reality when one's emotional reality is being systematically denied. She then locked eyes with the now pale Eleanor and asked a devastating question. Do you have any idea what I used to scream in my nightmares for the last 10 years? I screamed, "Will someone please save me?" Stephanie's voice grew stronger with every word. But I understand now. The only one who can save me is me. That realization is the cornerstone of recovery. With that final, devastating truth delivered, she calmly opened the car door and disappeared into the city. For the first time in anyone's memory, Eleanor Caldwell was left utterly powerless. But that kind of narcissistic rage doesn't just dissipate, it seeks a new target. Stephanie made her way to a private garage and unveiled a part of herself the Caldwells never knew existed. A cherry red convertible, a vibrant symbol of the life they had suppressed. She got in, slammed her foot on the gas, and exploded onto the street in an act of pure, unadulterated release. Then, in a moment of staggering symbolism, she flew through an intersection and smashed directly into a black Maybach. The custom Caldwell family crest on the license plate confirmed the cruel irony. It was Brandon's car. I was in the passenger seat next to him. His assistant, Eric, leapt out, his face a mask of fury, ready to verbally tear into the other driver. And then he saw her. He froze. Mrs. Caldwell? Stephanie seemed utterly serene. For 5 years, she had been a ghost in their lives, a beautiful, silent fixture. She was the human equivalent of a priceless vase, meant to be seen and not heard. To witness this quiet woman behind the wheel of a roaring muscle car, driving with such reckless freedom, was an act of cognitive dissonance nobody was prepared for. She offered no apology, no explanation. She simply handed Eric a business card. If there's any damage, have him contact my insurance manager. Then, sliding on a pair of dark sunglasses, she gave the engine a defiant roar and peeled away, leaving him standing there, utterly dumbfounded. Eric stumbled back into the car, completely bewildered. Mr. Caldwell, that was. that was Mrs. Caldwell, he stammered. And Brandon, sitting beside me, rubbing his temples, responded with a chilling lack of affect. Let's go. It was as if a complete stranger had hit us. His wife, the mother of his child, had just symbolically crashed her newfound freedom into the armored shell of his life, and his response was one of utter emotional detachment. He couldn't process it. And that profound inability to feel was the very reason he had ended up in my office. I often think about a client I had once, a man named Derek, whose story reminds me so much of the kind of blindness that can settle over a person. He was at a private track out in the country, closing some mundane real estate deal when the roar of engines pulled him in. A championship race was in full swing, and one car, a flash of brilliant candy apple red, was just poetry in motion. It moved with a liquid grace, hugging every curve as if it were born on that asphalt. It won, of course, and by a breathtaking margin. And when the driver stepped out, a hush fell over the track, a silence so total you could hear the wind. This driver was a silhouette in a fire-red racing suit, lean and radiating an almost intimidating confidence. I remember Derek telling me how every eye was locked on this person. Even he, a man who saw the world in spreadsheets and property lines, was just floored, staring with this unguarded awe he didn't know he was capable of. Then the helmet came off, And Derek said his whole world tilted on its axis. It was his ex-wife, Kayla. The words just fell out of him in a breath. Derek, my God, your ex-wife is a champion race car driver. He told me he couldn't respond. He just stood there, paralyzed, looking at this magnificent stranger who he once thought he knew better than anyone. It's a powerful thing to realize you never truly saw the person sleeping next to you. And that brings me to Jake. When he first sat in my office, he often described himself as an observer. He'd be at some gala, perched on a balcony, watching. He'd watch as a dozen men, slick with new money and ambition, let their gazes drift toward his mistress, Brittany, their desire so palpable it was almost an insult. He told me he'd feel a muscle jump in his jaw, a tightening he labeled as pride, but which I recognized as the raw instinct of possession. Brittany, he explained, was a master of their game. She knew he was there for hours but wouldn't spare him a single glance. For years, this was their unspoken pact. In public, they were two ships passing in the night. It gave him a thrill, this compartmentalized life he had so perfectly engineered. So it was no surprise that when a fresh-faced race promoter from out of town approached to make introductions, Brittany played her part to perfection. She offered a delicate, cool hand, her smile a study in practiced charm. "Mr. Hayes, what a pleasure to finally meet you." Jake, in turn, deployed his signature power move, silence. He just stood there, his expression unreadable, letting the quiet stretch into a palpable tension that sucked the air out of the space. The distant scream of the engines seemed to fade into nothing, and into that ringing silence, a voice dripping with the lazy entitlement of old money, sliced right through the carefully constructed illusion. The way Jake recounted this next part, his voice went flat, like he was narrating a slow-motion catastrophe he was forced to watch over and over. This was the precise moment the foundations of his world began to crack. He had just sealed a massive, multi-million-dollar sponsorship deal in the VIP lounge. The air was thick with the smell of champagne and victory. That's when she materialized. He said Brittany emerged from his Maybach, moved toward him with a predator's grace, and slid her arm through his. It wasn't a request. It was an act of claiming territory. Then she looked right past him, her eyes locking on his wife, Sarah, and gave a small, lethal smile. It was the smile of a queen taking the board. And as he described it, I felt a knot of cold anger tighten in my own stomach. As they began to walk away, some oblivious guest in the crowd called out, "Wow, Mr. Hayes even brings the wife to business meetings. Talk about dedication." Jake told me he saw his young assistant, Spencer, who was standing near Sarah, give her a look. It was just a flicker, a brief, unguarded moment of pity. But it was more damning than the comment itself. And in that instant, Jake knew exactly what was going through Sarah's mind with the force of a physical blow. What a pathetic creature. She can't even hold on to her own husband. He said Sarah's reaction was terrifying in its quietness. She didn't cry or yell. She simply turned, her back as straight as a steel rod, and walked away, disappearing into the noise of the track, leaving the smoldering wreckage of their life behind her. Of course, Jake wouldn't find this out for several more hours, but the very first thing Sarah did was get into her car and call her divorce attorney. "What's the timeline?" she asked, her voice, I imagine, impossibly calm. 7 days, the lawyer told her. Just 7 more days until the final papers were signed. After a decade of feeling like she was being slowly erased, 7 days was an eternity and no time at all. She was just starting to breathe, to feel the first stirrings of a future. When her phone buzzed with the sound of his office. It was Spencer, Jake's painfully loyal assistant. Mrs. Hayes, the CEO was just checking in to see if you were planning on dropping off that seafood chowder he likes for his lunch. And just one other thing, Spencer continued, his tone relentlessly upbeat, utterly clueless to the bomb he was handling. Connor's art teacher called the office phone. She said she couldn't reach you. Apparently, he forgot his craft project. She was hoping you could run it over to the school sometime this afternoon. In my work, I see these breaking points all the time. Jake later admitted that he could picture the scene perfectly. Sarah, just the night before she'd finally asked for the divorce, bent over the dining table late into the night, painstakingly stitching a little hand puppet for their son, a crafting tutorial playing quietly on her phone beside her. When she had left that morning to meet with her lawyer, the unfinished puppet was likely still sitting there, a small, soft casualty of the war she had just declared on her own life. The next words Spencer relayed to Jake were the ones that finally, truly signaled the end. Sarah had apparently looked out her car window at the overcast sky and said into the phone, her voice utterly devoid of emotion, "Tell Jake there is no more seafood chowder. There will never be any seafood chowder again. And regarding Connor's school projects, you can inform him that I am no longer the contact for those matters. Do not use this number for his affairs again." Then she disconnected the call and blocked him. All the while, Jake sat in his glass tower, a king who had no idea his entire kingdom had just been dissolved. Spencer stood in the middle of Jake's cavernous office, holding the phone like it was a dead thing, completely adrift. "Sir." Mrs. Hayes disconnected. I tried to call back, but it went to her voicemail. I think she may have blocked the office number. Maybe you should try her from your cell? Jake told me he let out a frustrated sigh, deeply annoyed at this domestic drama bleeding into his workday. For what felt like the first time in years, he pulled out his personal phone to manage his own family. He scrolled to the contact he'd clinically labeled wife and typed out a brusque message. What is this tantrum about? An instant later, a cold, automated notification in red appeared just below his text. It said, "This user requires friend verification to receive messages. You are not on their contacts list. Please send a friend request to initiate a chat." Spencer, who was still frozen in place, couldn't help but see the screen. He saw the red notification, and just above it, the last message Sarah had sent a week ago, an unread invitation to their son's birthday party. And then the kid, with the kind of brutal honesty only the young possess, murmured, "Oh, wow. Mrs. Hayes's birthday is on the same day as Miss Brittany's, so her birthday was yesterday, too." Jake described the feeling to me as a sudden, sickening plunge, a wave of shame so hot it felt like it could scald him from the inside out. Spencer's voice was barely a whisper. "Sir, did you remember to get her a present?" A thick, unbreathable silence filled that massive office before Jake, my brilliant, powerful, and utterly lost client, finally managed to answer, his voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "I was not aware." And Spencer, bless his young heart, didn't even react. He'd seen the unanswered messages. Before the assistant could say anything else, Jake's defenses snapped back into place. "Source a supplementary birthday gift for her. You take care of it." "Right away, sir," Spencer said. But when he looked up, Jake was already staring at a spreadsheet on his monitor, his focus absolute. The entire gut-wrenching exchange had been filed away, dismissed as a logistical problem to be solved by others. Spencer told me later he quietly turned and left, an errand boy dispatched to buy a token of apology for a woman whose life had just been detonated. That evening, the gift Spencer had picked out, an obscenely expensive diamond necklace, arrived at Sarah's apartment. She was startled for a moment, he heard. But then, without any hesitation, she simply refused the delivery. From her perspective, what was she even supposed to do with it? She had no idea what kind of bizarre, manipulative game he was playing now. Her birthday had passed, unnoticed and unmentioned. What was the meaning of a gift delivered by an assistant 24 hours late? For the last 10 years of their marriage, she had made the same silent birthday wish, year after year, to be free. And by finally granting her the divorce, Jake had, in his own destructive and thoughtless way, given her the only gift she'd ever truly wanted. She had believed this 7-day legal period would be a space of quiet separation. But just after the courier left, her phone buzzed. It was a text from a number she couldn't block so easily. Jake's mother. Sarah, I have no interest in whatever childish drama you and my son are indulging in, but you are still his wife, and my grandson will not be made to suffer for your theatrics. Sarah told me she actually let out a dry, humorless laugh. Suffer? Their son, Connor, had been the one gently asking them for over a year if they could please finally get a divorce. Before Sarah could even begin to formulate a reply, a second text arrived. If you expect this process to continue without complications, you will be present at the family home this weekend to spend time with Connor, as is our tradition. A cold dread washed over Sarah. Jake had always loathed the suffocating rituals of his wealthy family. It was the entire reason they'd fled his family's sprawling estate in Greenwich for the cold anonymity of a Manhattan high-rise years ago. And now, he was using the very cage he had escaped as a weapon to drag her back in. In the years after their son Spencer was born, they'd settled into a cold, unyielding arrangement. Every weekend, Ashley was required to bring him back to the family estate. That day was a Friday. On any other Friday, she would have already picked Spencer up from school and been in the middle of packing. Nathan, he told me, was almost always buried in work, a convenient excuse that kept him away until after 10 at night. But on this day, for reasons he was only beginning to unpack in our sessions, he decided to be there. So when Ashley pushed open the heavy front door, moving through the life he'd built for them, she walked directly into an ambush. He was already there, waiting for her. And the shock of it, he said, visibly rocked her. This is the point in his story where, despite everything I know about the damage he caused, a part of me always aches for the man he was then, so blind and so desperate. He was, in his own words, trying to manage a situation that had already spiraled out of his control. Ashley tried to move past him, heading for the sweeping staircase, but he physically stepped into her path, a deliberate act of containment. He asked her, his voice stripped of all emotion, "Did you like the birthday gift?" He saw the confusion cloud her features. She just stared, and he could almost hear her thinking, "Doesn't he know I sent it back?" And then came the devastatingly simple answer. Of course he didn't. He had outsourced the entire gesture. To avoid a confrontation, she gave a short, meaningless nod. That was all the opening he needed. "Spencer is carving a wooden charm for Kayla. I told him you'd come upstairs to help him finish it." And just like that, the curtain was pulled back. The unexpected gift, his waiting there, it was all a calculated negotiation. He remembered the sound she made then, not a laugh, but a hollow, bitter noise that seemed to suck all the warmth from the marble foyer. Without a word, She drove her shoulder into his as she stormed past him and up the stairs. He just stood there, watching her go, a deep frown etching his features, still believing he was the one in control. Upstairs, their son, Spencer, was hunched over a small desk, completely lost in his task, a whittling knife moving carefully in his small hands as he shaped a piece of wood. When Ashley came into the room, Spencer was so focused he didn't even hear her. As she got closer, she saw it. A stunningly detailed good luck charm, already perfectly carved and polished, resting on the desk. Next to it, her son was struggling with a raw block of wood, his little hands trying desperately to copy the finished piece. Nathan recalled how the soft whisper of her shoes on the rug made Spencer flinch. The moment the boy saw his mother, his posture became rigid, defensive, a reaction that Nathan admitted must have felt like a knife to her heart. Spencer immediately grabbed the finished charm, the one Nathan had actually carved for his sister, Kayla, and clutched it protectively. His face, a small echo of his father's, turned to stone. "Mom," he said, his voice completely flat, "this is the one Daddy made for Aunt Kayla." "You can't take it." When Nathan recounted that to me, the pain in the room was immense. It's a wound that goes deeper than words. He described the look on Ashley's face as a total collapse, like watching a person's spirit fracture right in front of him. I cannot imagine the agony of that moment. This was the child she had dedicated her entire world to for years, and he was looking at her like she was an intruder, a threat. Nathan said she just stared at Spencer's face, his own face, in miniature, and it was as if all the oxygen had been stolen from her lungs, leaving her gasping for air in that silent, gilded room, utterly and finally broken. "You don't need to guard it so fiercely," Ashley said, her voice so thin and fragile it sounded like it might shatter. "I have never wanted a single thing that belongs to another person. Besides, your father and I are divorcing. Your precious Aunt Kayla will be your new mother before you know it." It was then that a voice like shattering ice cut through the tension from the doorway. It was Nathan. "Ashley, what sort of poison are you feeding our son? Are you even fit to be his mother?" It was the most he had spoken to her in months, and he chose to use his words as weapons, tearing her down piece by piece in front of their child. She turned to face him in a slow, deliberate motion and met his cold, impenetrable gaze with a tiny broken smile. "You're absolutely right, Nathan. I'm not fit. So, you had better find Spencer a mother who is." With that, she turned for the door, making a clean break. But his hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her arm in a grip that was less about affection and all about ownership. In that exact instant, a bright, cheerful tone rang from Spencer's smartwatch. The boy's face lit up. "Daddy, it's Aunt Kayla. She's on a video call." In the space of a single heartbeat, Nathan's hand fell from her arm. Ashley stood frozen, watching him cross the room to their son as his entire being transformed. The cold, hard mask he wore for her dissolved into a genuine, radiant smile for the woman on the screen. It was in that moment, he told me, that he saw a profound, crushing weariness settle over her, a weight heavier than anything he'd ever witnessed. She didn't say another word. She just walked down the long, quiet hall to the guest room, closed the door behind her, and clicked the lock. The air in the room was freezing, and even though the calendar read June, she felt like she was being buried alive in a cold, dark grave. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for the oblivion of sleep, but instead fell into a cascade of memories. Suddenly, she was 16 years old, sobbing uncontrollably because her beloved terrier had been put down. The reason? A young Nathan Hayes had a mild allergy, and it was decided that his future wife couldn't be a dog owner. The memory dissolved, then reformed. She was 19, and her father was telling her she'd be attending a finishing school in Switzerland. An arrangement conceived and paid for by the Hayes family to ensure she was properly molded. A family friend once told Nathan that Ashley possessed a kind of brilliance that you see only once in a generation. She'd earned a full ride to Yale and was on track to be at the very top of her class, with the world at her feet. But she chose Nathan, and choosing him meant choosing his family and their sprawling, iron-fenced estate, where she was systematically reshaped into a Hayes wife, slowly erasing the woman she was supposed to become. Nathan admitted to me that she once told him about a recurring nightmare where the 16-year-old who lost her dog and the 19-year-old who lost her future were both screaming at her, "Ashley, run! Don't you dare look back." He knew, with the kind of perfect, painful clarity that only comes with hindsight, that they had been right all along. He always knew she felt like a bird in a gilded cage. He remembered her saying once that if her life was just going to be a beautiful cage, she would rather not have a life at all. For weeks, violent nightmares had been tearing through her sleep, but the internal programming his family had so carefully installed in her never failed. She was always up at 5 a.m. In the life that was now just a memory, this was when she would rise to make breakfast for him and Spencer. That morning, though, he came downstairs to find only a single glass of milk on the marble island, still warm. He knew she'd been tormented by his mother's latest passive-aggressive command, and he saw the weight of it all as he sighed, turned, and walked out of the silent, oppressive house. The gut-wrenching truth, which he would only learn later that day, was that the house had already been empty for hours. Ashley was gone. He found out that she and Spencer had left before sunrise, driven by her friend Jessica to a nearby lookout, just to watch the sun come up. When Nathan told me that part, a raw, broken laugh escaped him. It was so painfully clear to everyone, even him, that Spencer was long past the age of needing that kind of coddling. But his mother had been relentless, insisting Ashley perform the role. In the cold, transactional world of the Hayes family, she was never the matriarch, never even truly his wife. She was, he confessed, a placeholder, a beautiful vase to be placed on display wherever the real Mrs. Hayes was needed. After that weekend from hell, her best friend Jessica had stepped in. She took Ashley to the local university just to watch the college baseball team practice. Jessica had told her, "You need to get your head out of that toxic house and get it screwed on straight." And, miraculously, it started to work. Nathan heard how those 18-year-old kids with their easy charm had called her ma'am and given her the kind of simple, direct attention she hadn't experienced in more than a decade. After only a few days of being treated like a person instead of a possession, Ashley's entire demeanor began to change. He heard that Jessica was thrilled. She had nudged her friend, saying, "See, now that you remember what decent guys are like, don't you finally feel like that cold old Nathan isn't worth a single tear?" And Ashley had smiled. A real, vibrant smile he hadn't seen since they were teenagers. "Yeah," she'd said, her voice full of newfound strength. "I don't love him anymore." When that story was relayed back to Nathan, he said it was like watching his entire world collapse from the inside out. I often think about the moment Brandon's world began to fracture. He described it to me with the detached precision of a man recounting a film scene, but the pain was etched in every word. He was standing in the illuminated archway of some charity benefit, a place he detested, watching his wife, Stephanie, being held captive by a circle of her so-called friends. They were pouring on the flattery, he said, thick and cloying. Then one of them delivered the line that would echo in Brandon's mind for months. You should have left him ages ago. Any one of us would value you more than that cold, robotic Brandon Hayes. He saw the words land, saw the poison seep in. They were painting him as a villain and telling her to escape, to find someone young and full of life. But the part that truly broke him, the image that became a recurring nightmare, was that Stephanie's lips were starting to curve into a smile. She was about to agree. In that infinitesimal space between her acceptance and their triumph, his assistant, Eric, coughed, a sharp, intentional sound. Only then did her eyes find him in the doorway. Eric, his assistant, looked pale and shaken, but Brandon told me he felt nothing. He locked it all down, pulling on the stoic, impenetrable mask he had perfected over a lifetime. That was his tragedy, he would later realize. He had built his walls so high that he'd walled himself in, never letting Stephanie see the man drowning behind the facade, and her reaction in that moment was a blade to the heart. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply looked right through him, a ghost at his own wife's party, and turned to guide her friend Jessica away as if he were nothing more than a statue. She must have assumed he'd do what he always did, stand back and let her go. But something inside his carefully controlled world finally snapped. He couldn't just watch his reality dissolve. He crossed the floor in 3 long strides, blocking her escape, his fingers closing around her arm. "We have a family event," he said, his voice low and tight. "You're leaving with me. Eat, sir." He gave her no room to argue, maneuvering her through the crowded room and into the crisp night air where his car waited like a silent accomplice. In the insulated quiet of the vehicle, she was completely stunned, her movements robotic. The version of Brandon she knew was a man of cold courtesy and profound emotional neglect. He treated her like a precious but inanimate object. This sudden, raw possessiveness was a terrifying aberration, a side of him she had only ever glimpsed in the dark confines of their bedroom, and never like this. It was a complete violation of their unspoken, frigid contract. As she tried to process the shock, he spoke, his voice strained with an emotion he couldn't name. "Stephanie, for families like ours, isn't a suitable match the only thing that matters?" It was a catastrophic error, a desperate, clumsy jab using her own words against her. He'd overheard her saying something similar to Jessica, and in his panic, he threw it back at her, arguing that love was a frivolous fantasy. He was telling her that being wanted, being truly known, was a luxury their social stratum couldn't afford. A brittle, empty laugh escaped her. For the first time all evening, she faced him, and the Arctic rage in her eyes was so potent, it stunned him into absolute stillness. "But your idea of a suitable match," she said, her voice shaking with a decade of swallowed fury, "is one where I am required to silently suffer for the rest of my life. And tell me, Brandon, what on earth gives you the right to demand that of anyone?" He just stared. He had no answer, no defense, because in his world, the question itself was absurd. It had never occurred to him to consider her rights. Exhausted beyond measure, Stephanie gave up trying to understand the man next to her. She closed her eyes, leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, and pretended to be asleep. When they pulled up to the discreet entrance of a private club, she realized with a jolt that he had brought her to an intimate gathering of his closest friends, a circle she had never been permitted to enter. In all their years together, he had never once included her in an informal event like this. Stephanie was acutely aware that his friends disliked her. They saw her as an outsider, a decoration. She had once overheard their cruel little nickname for her, whispered when they thought she was gone, his porcelain doll. So she sat there, projecting a calm indifference that cost her everything, making a single glass of wine last. After a while, feeling the first warm tendrils of the alcohol, she murmured an excuse and slipped away to the ladies' room. The moment the door closed behind her, one of Brandon's oldest friends, Mark, leaned in. "Brandon," Mark said, his voice a concerned murmur beneath the gala's ambient noise. "Your wife hasn't smiled once. She's looking past you like you're not even there. I hate to be the one to say it, but the rumors about you two, they've got to be true." Brandon Hayes gave no sign he'd heard, just kept swirling the dark red wine in his glass, his eyes fixed on the liquid. "Who said anything about a divorce?" he finally responded, his tone dangerously quiet. "The day I married Stephanie Vance, I made a commitment. For the rest of my life, my wife is Stephanie." His friend looked at him, completely dumbfounded. "Ah, are you being serious right now?" Mark stammered, his jaw slack. Brandon just gave him a look that could have frozen fire and said nothing. Unsettled, Mark pressed on, trying to find some way to break through. "Brandon, you remember Miller? That tech CEO you partnered with last year? He was exactly the same. Never took his wife anywhere. Never even mentioned her. No one knew what she looked like. Next thing you know, she was gone, filed for divorce and vanished. I hear he's still spending millions trying to win her back," Mark urged, his voice full of genuine concern. "If you mean what you said about forever with Stephanie, you need to start treating her like she's actually in your life. If you don't, you're going to end up just like him, a lonely man in a big, empty house filled with nothing but ghosts." For a single, fleeting second, the hand swirling the wineglass stopped. Then, with a chilling and absolute certainty that defied all reason, Brandon said, "She would never dare." And at that very instant, across town in the cold, echoing silence of the club's restroom, Stephanie's phone screen lit up her face. A single text from her lawyer was displayed in the darkness. "Ms. Vance, the divorce decree between yourself and Mr. Brandon Hayes has been finalized. It is ready for you to pick up at your earliest convenience." The day she had been dreaming of was finally here. As Brandon would later reconstruct from a dozen different sources, she walked straight out of that restroom, past his table without a glance, hailed a cab, and went to collect the document that represented her liberation. He pictured her unfolding it under the faint glow of a streetlight, reading the words that set her free. From that moment on, she was no longer bound by his edicts. She didn't have to navigate the oppressive, unspoken rules of his powerful family. She would never again have to choke down flavorless, steamed vegetables to maintain the impossibly thin figure of Mrs. Hayes. She didn't have to wear the same muted palette of makeup, smile at people she despised, or recite the carefully crafted lies about her wonderful storybook marriage. In our sessions, Brandon would often return to this one image, a scene he pieced together from things he'd been told, a scene he tortured himself with. He'd picture Stephanie, his Stephanie, walking away from the courthouse. In his mind, she could finally try bungee jumping. She could take up rally racing. She could book a flight with no return date and vanish into the Andes. 1,000 different lives, none of which included him, were suddenly blooming in front of her. Her best friend, Jessica, met her on the steps, and to mark this first night of her new life, she insisted they eat something the woman formerly known as Mrs. Hayes would have been forbidden from even thinking about. He saw them walking toward a loud, chaotic row of food trucks, a beautiful assault of neon and happy noise. He imagined them ordering thick milkshakes, messy pulled pork sandwiches, and sundaes overflowing with every possible topping. You can eat whatever the hell you want now. He could almost hear Jessica telling her, a triumphant look on her face. And as Brandon described Stephanie inhaling the smoky, forbidden scent of grilled meat and spices, he confessed to me that he believed in that moment she was remembering what it felt like to be truly alive for the first time in a decade. In his mind's eye, they ate barbecue right off the skewers, drank cheap beer from the bottle, and danced on the broken sidewalk to a tinny beat from a stranger's radio. They laughed. It was the kind of loud, unrestrained, glorious laughter he hadn't heard from her in years. And eventually, he imagined, Stephanie laughed so hard that the laughter cracked open and became a torrent of sobs as the immense weight that had been pressing down on her soul for 10 long years finally, mercifully, shattered into dust. When you've been silenced for that long, the grief has to go somewhere. Emboldened by the beer, she finally unblocked her son Caleb's number and hit dial. By a terrible twist of fate, Brandon was with him when the call came through. The moment Caleb answered, she managed to get the words out through her tears. "Caleb, listen to me. No matter how much you hate me, I need you to know that I am your mother. The woman who almost died giving birth to you, that was me." And Brandon could only stand there, frozen, and listen as that single raw truth completely shattered his son's entire world. The emotional devastation of that night is what finally brought him to me. Brandon sent a long, chaotic email in the early hours of the morning, a perfect testament to how a man's universe can utterly collapse in less than 48 hours. It had all started with a phone call from Stephanie, her voice sharp and brittle. "I was the one who held your hair back all night when you had food poisoning," she'd said. "The second you called me vicious to defend that girl, Jessica, you stopped being my husband. You don't get to call me your wife anymore. You lost that right." And Brandon, in his vast and tragic blindness, simply stood there and asked her, "Stephanie, what on earth are you talking about?" He genuinely had no memory of it at all. When Brandon sat in my office and talked about that phone call, the memory was still so raw it felt like an open wound. He described a heavy, suffocating silence hanging on the line after he answered, which was shattered by a laugh from his wife, Stephanie. He said it was a sharp, brittle sound, completely empty of warmth. He knew with a sinking certainty that their son, Liam, was right there in the room with her. Then her voice came, laced with a terrifying calm. "Brandon, you think you have time to give me a lecture? You should be using that time to teach your son how to be a decent human being. Were you aware that last night, on my birthday, your son told me I should divorce you so you could finally be with Jessica?" And the most twisted part of it all, it was the longest, most articulate sentence the boy has ever said to me. The last thing she said to him before the connection died was a perfectly aimed shot to the heart. "Congratulations, Brandon. I've finally given every single one of you exactly what you wanted." And that was it. The line went dead. He told me, he called back, frantically, maybe 10 or 15 times, but each call was a direct flight to her voicemail. He just stood there, staring at a blank phone screen, feeling like the floor had vanished beneath him. In that same moment, Stephanie was already with her friend Chloe, putting her escape plan into action. The very next morning, she bought a one-way ticket to a country she refused to name. She understood the situation had reached a point of no return, and the second her own wealthy family heard the news, they would swarm in, demanding she make amends. The thought that they would try to force her back into her life with Brandon, to plead with him for another chance, was a nightmare she couldn't bear. Even worse was the possibility they'd try to broker a marriage to the next richest man they could find. She had to get away from New York, and she made a solemn vow to herself that she would never return. After a tear-soaked goodbye with Chloe, Stephanie picked up a single, small duffel bag containing only the most basic necessities and walked outside. But as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the crisp morning air catching in her throat, her heart seized. Parked at the curb, gleaming and sinister, was a black Maybach. The back door opened and Brandon stepped out, holding little Liam by the hand. They walked straight for her. Brandon's gaze was fixed on his son, his voice low and firm. "Liam, apologize to your mother." Oh, the boy looked impossibly small and frail, his little fingers clutching his father's coat as he managed a stiff, formal bow. "Mom, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that stuff. I shouldn't have said you and Dad should get a divorce. I was wrong. Please, can you forgive me?" But Stephanie, as Brandon described it, just gave this soft, tired little laugh, as if the apology were spoken in a language she no longer understood. "There's no need for you to apologize," she said, her voice gentle. In her mind, she had already processed the hurt and moved beyond it. She was, in every sense of the word, done. But then Brandon did something that, even as he recounted it to me, he seemed shocked by. He spoke. "I apologize," he said, the words sounding foreign and raspy in his own throat. "I didn't raise him properly. This is on me, too." It was a seismic event. The day Brandon Hayes, a man whose entire identity was built on a fortress of pride, admitted fault. But a single apology is just a bandage on a gaping wound, and she knew it. It was then she remembered a package she'd tucked into her bag, something she had planned on mailing to him when she was safely away. She looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze clear and steady, and said, "Brandon, if you are truly sorry, then you can give me a ride to the airport." He just stood there, looking completely poleaxed by the request. "There's no international travel scheduled for the family. Where are you going?" A sad, knowing smile touched her lips, twisting the knife just a little. "Oh, right. So, unless it's official Hayes family business, I'm not allowed to have my own plans?" He immediately started stumbling over his words, a frantic mess of, "No, no, that's not what I meant at all." For the first time in their entire relationship, Brandon sounded genuinely panicked, but she was so far past caring. There was a cruel, poetic justice to it all that you almost had to respect. He was the man who had driven her to their wedding, delivering her to what she now saw as her beautiful cage. It was only fitting that he would be the one to drive her away from it, to personally snip the very last thread connecting their lives. That entire drive to JFK was spent in a dense, suffocating quiet. Just before she got out of the car, Stephanie turned and handed Brandon a beautifully wrapped box. "A parting gift," she said simply. He told me he was completely paralyzed, just utterly baffled. but his hands took the box from her. "Thank you," was all he could choke out. Little Liam, his face a perfect picture of a child's hopeful ignorance, looked up at his mom and asked, "What about me, Mommy?" And for the first time that morning, Stephanie offered a real smile, one that actually lit up her eyes. "Yours is in there too, sweetie. It's a gift for both of you. You should be happy." Then she looked back at Brandon, and her final instruction was delivered with chilling precision. "Don't open it for 1 hour." By that time, Stephanie's voice was disturbingly calm, a stark island of stillness in the chaotic sea of the terminal. "My plane will already be in the air." For one terrifying second, Brandon felt the ironclad armor he wore in public begin to fracture. He was Brandon Hayes. He didn't beg. But he heard a voice that sounded like a stranger's whisper his own words. "Come back soon." She gave him that same sad, empty smile he'd seen so often in the last few months. Without another word, she turned her back on him, on their son, on their entire life, and was simply absorbed by the river of travelers. She wasn't coming back. As Brandon stood frozen on the curb, a cold, unfamiliar dread began to coil in his stomach, watching the woman he called his wife get swallowed by the crowd. He was left standing there, clutching the box she had given him, a final, silent artifact of their marriage. A deep, primal urge welled up inside him to tear it open right there, to find some kind of answer inside, but a small hand tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy." Liam's voice was serious and small. "We promised Mom we'd wait an hour. A promise is a promise." And so, for the next 60 agonizing minutes, Brandon sat in the climate-controlled silence of his luxury sedan, a multi-million-dollar financial report lying unread on his lap. He confessed to me he never saw a single number on the page. His entire being was focused on that box. When the hour was finally, mercifully up, Liam, practically vibrating with excitement, reached for it. "Daddy, what is it? What did Mommy give us that's such a big secret?" With a soft, final click, the lid popped open. Brandon told me he reflexively looked away, a subconscious flinch before his gaze was pulled back to the box in his son's lap. There, nestled on a bed of brilliant white silk, was not a Rolex or a set of cufflinks, but a single, starkly official document. A certificate of divorce. Liam, at only 3 years old, was just learning to recognize letters. He stared down at the paper, his lips moving silently as he tried to form the shapes of the strange, formal words. Then he looked up, his bright, innocent eyes filled with a question that shattered Brandon's world into a million pieces. "Daddy, what's a divorce certificate? Mommy said it was a present for both of us." "Is this little book the present?" The boy's innocent voice was completely lost in the roaring sound that filled Brandon's head. The financial report was swiped from his lap onto the floor. He shot up from the driver's seat so violently that his elbow knocked over a cup of coffee, sending the scalding liquid pouring down the front of his $1,000 suit. He didn't even feel the burn. A dark, ugly stain bloomed across the fabric, a grimly perfect symbol for the moment, but his eyes were glued to the box. He was only vaguely aware that his own hands were shaking so badly he couldn't have clenched them into a fist to save his life. The small, crimson-covered booklet sat there, radiating a kind of quiet, devastating power. He would later tell me it reminded him of Stephanie herself during her last few months living in his house. A constant, silent presence that he had learned to completely ignore. A tidal wave of pure, undiluted panic crashed over him, so powerful He felt like he was drowning in the driver's seat. There was a terrifying conviction in his gut that if he actually opened that certificate, a fundamental piece of his world, of his very identity as a husband, would be permanently deleted. And this was Brandon Hayes, a man known by colleagues and rivals alike as an unbreakable force of nature. But in the sterile silence of his car, with his young son as a witness, he completely shattered. With a hand that trembled so much it was visible from the back seat, he reached out and lifted the thin booklet. He had to take several huge, ragged breaths before he found the strength to open it. The second his eyes landed on his own name, Brandon Hayes, printed in cold black ink right next to Stephanie Hayes, the sight was so official, so brutally final, his brain just refused to accept it. It felt like a system crash. He was divorced. His first, most primal instinct was to call her, to scream, to demand she explain. But then, the crushing reality hit him. She was on a plane, 30,000 feet above the earth, completely and totally beyond his reach. A white-hot, blinding rage tore through him, an emotion so violent he had to physically stop himself from acting on the insane impulse to charter a private jet and chase her across the globe. He did the next best thing. He called his assistant. "Get me Stephanie's flight information," he snarled into the phone. "I want her final destination. And then I want you to find a way to get her on a flight back to New York immediately. And while you're doing that, find out who the hell processed this divorce. There was no agreement. We never even saw the inside of a courtroom." When Brandon first sat in my office, the first thing he described was the sound of his own voice on the phone that day. How it felt alien, like gravel tearing through his throat. He said, "How is that even possible?" And the words were ragged, frayed with a panic he'd never known. Brandon was a man who built his entire identity on the foundation of unshakable control. For him, losing control wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a form of ego death. On the other end of that call, his assistant, Eric, must have felt the floor drop out from under him. In 10 years, Eric had never heard his boss sound anything but surgical and composed, even when a competitor's move cost them billions. And now, this complete unraveling was over his quiet, unassuming wife, Stephanie. Eric, a true professional even when utterly baffled, just managed a crisp, "Yes, sir," followed by the sound of frantic typing. Brandon told me he started pacing his vast home office, feeling like a predator trapped in a cage of his own making, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. It was a physical sensation, he said, a pressure building behind his ribs, in a move that screamed desperation, a language he wasn't fluent in. He opened a social media app and sent a friend request to Stephanie, the woman who had systematically erased him from her digital life. His thumbs hammered at the screen. "What is this divorce certificate? You're a grown woman. Stop playing these childish games. Call me when your flight lands. Ethan and I are worried sick." He remembered pausing, the air catching in his lungs. His next words a chaotic blend of command and a plea he couldn't quite bring himself to voice. "Whatever this is, we can talk about it. We're adults. This isn't how you handle things. You're a mother, Stephanie, not some impulsive teenager." But each message he sent was swallowed by a void, a profound and absolute silence that felt louder than any argument. Brandon finally collapsed into his leather office chair, the material unforgiving against his back, and pinched the bridge of his nose, feeling an exhaustion so deep it felt like it had seeped into his bones. At his feet, his son, Ethan, who had been quietly building with blocks, looked up at him, his gaze unnervingly direct. Daddy, does this gift mean Mommy isn't our mommy anymore? The question was a gut punch, echoing her final devastating words, which were now burned into his memory. So did our son. A massive, solid lump formed in Brandon's throat, making it hard to draw a full breath. The pressure in his chest was immense. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking. Stephanie, did you really just give up on us? The silence that answered him was its own unique form of torture. Her plane has to have landed by now. Stephanie, where in God's name are you? Brandon had lost track of the time, of the number of increasingly desperate messages he'd launched into the digital ether. And with every minute that ticked by without a response, a strange and insidious narrative began to take root in his mind. He was the victim here. He was the one who had been wronged. He and Stephanie had been functional. He used that word, functional, as if it was the highest ideal of a partnership. For 5 years, they had maintained a peaceful, orderly existence. What could possibly motivate her to detonate their carefully constructed life with a surprise divorce? To simply vanish without a single conversation? His mind replayed their final talk from the day before. The memory of her tone, so cold, so devoid of any emotion, making a clammy sweat break out on his skin. Just then, the sharp buzz of his phone shattered the tense quiet. He lunged for it, swiping to answer before he even saw the name on the screen. Stephanie, you finally called me back. I must have sent you 100 messages. Why didn't you pick up? A beat of stunned silence met his barrage of questions, before a hesitant male voice finally cut in. Sir, it's me. It was Eric. Brandon glanced at the screen, and the fragile hope that had flared to life in his chest was extinguished in an instant. He rubbed his temples, his voice dropping into a low, menacing growl, his default setting when cornered. My mistake. I'm on edge. What have you got? Tell me you found something on Mrs. Hayes. When Brandon told me about this part, he described how Eric was choosing his words with the kind of painstaking care a bomb squad might use. Sir, Eric started, his voice strained. We tracked Mrs. Hayes to a flight that landed in Europe, but the trail ends there. We believe she booked connecting flights under a different name. We have no definitive location for her at this time. Each word seemed to shrink Eric's presence, while Brandon felt his own anger expanding, becoming a cold, dense mass inside him. After a long, heavy pause, he finally asked, his voice like grinding stone, the divorce. What about the papers? We found the court filing, sir, Eric confirmed, his voice tight with tension. The settlement agreement, sir, it has your signature on it. We had our legal team review it, and then we hired a forensic document examiner. Both have confirmed its authenticity. Everything is, regrettably, everything is completely in order. That was the phrase that finally shattered him. What the hell do you mean, in order? Eric, on the other end, seemed to freeze for a second before he could speak again. He explained, his words now coming in a measured rush. In the settlement, sir, Mrs. Hayes made no claims on any marital assets. She signed away everything. The houses, the investments, her shares in the company. It has all been placed into a blind trust for your son, Ethan. She designated it as her complete contribution for all future child support. She also, sir, she signed over full and sole custody of Ethan to you. Brandon told me he could almost hear the man's heart pounding through the phone. We've all witnessed messy divorces, brutal wars waged over silverware and stock options. But Stephanie Hayes, she hadn't fought. She had simply vanished. She walked away from a fortune without a backward glance. Brandon wrestled with it for weeks, unable to decide if she had grown to despise the wealth he had built, or if she was just too profoundly broken to engage in another battle. And while Eric was still talking, trying to cushion the blow, Brandon ended the call, leaving his assistant speaking into an abrupt and unnerving silence. For a long time, Brandon just stood there in his study, the phone still pressed to his ear, the deadline humming. He was trying to process information his brain was simply not built to compute. From his perspective, their life was a project plan running perfectly on schedule. And then, in less than 24 hours, the entire structure had been razed to the ground. After a long, suffocating silence, a ragged sigh escaped his lips. "Stephanie," he whispered into the stillness, "what did I miss?" And in that precise moment, the heavy door to his study creaked open and his son, Ethan, walked in. The little boy padded silently across the thick rug and hugged Brandon's leg, looking up at him with an expression of heartbreaking innocence. "Daddy," he said, his voice shockingly bright, "did you get the paper from Aunt Megan? The one that means Mommy is gone forever so I can get a new mommy?" He wasn't done. "Daddy, you should marry Aunt Megan. I really, really want her to be my new mommy." On any other day, Brandon said, he would have dismissed it as the strange, disconnected logic of a 3-year-old. But hearing those words, in that room, at that moment, it was like salt being poured into a wound. The words didn't sound like a child's wish. They sounded like a script. How did it come to this? The question echoed in the hollow space inside his skull. Could his wife, Stephanie, have truly left because of something their son said? He stared down at the small boy, a deep frown creasing his forehead. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a raw, jagged thing, far more severe than he intended. "You're only 3. What could you possibly know about any of this? Don't you ever say that again. You have one mother, do you understand me? There is no new mother." Ethan's face, which had been bright and open, crumpled in on itself. His features twisted in confusion and pain before he burst into a storm of hiccuping sobs. "I want a new mommy. I want Aunt Megan to be my new mommy." "I don't want my old mommy. She's boring like a nanny. She's not any fun." And with those words, something inside Brandon fractured. He swooped down, grabbing his son, his movements sharp with a surge of adrenaline and rage, and delivered a single, light but firm swat to his bottom. "Who taught you to say that?" In that split second, all the disparate, confusing pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with the force of a collision. Ethan was 3. He didn't understand the legal finality of divorce. He would never, ever call the woman who rocked him to sleep a nanny unless someone had been methodically, maliciously planting that poison in his ear. That one tap was nothing, but Ethan shrieked as if he'd been seriously hurt. He squirmed out of Brandon's arms and ran out of the study, his small voice wailing down the hallway. "I hate you, Daddy. If you don't get me a new mommy, I'm going to run away." Brandon, his nerves frayed to the breaking point, took a step to go after him, but the sharp, insistent buzz of his phone stopped him cold. It was Megan, and in that one gut-wrenching second, he was faced with a choice. He hesitated, the duty of a father warring with the sudden, urgent need for answers, and he answered the call instead of comforting his son. He raised the phone to his ear, and Megan's voice, a carefully constructed performance of sweet concern, filled the silence. "Brandon, Ethan just told me the most bizarre thing, that you and Stephanie are getting a divorce. What on earth is happening? Please tell me he's just a confused little boy." A long, heavy sigh escaped Brandon's lips, carrying the weight of the entire day with it. "It's a misunderstanding. I am not divorcing Stephanie. Was there something you needed?" A fraction of a second of silence hung on the line, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. The sweetness was still there, but underneath it, he could now detect a faint, unmistakable trace of disappointment. "Hey, it's nothing major. I was just calling because, well, we were all supposed to see the fireworks at the amusement park tonight. I just hadn't heard from you or Kayla, so I wanted to make sure everything was okay." The words landed like a stone in Derek's stomach, churning up a sharp, acidic guilt. He had completely forgotten. "Jessica, I'm so incredibly sorry. It slipped my mind entirely. We'll have to do it another time." But when Derek finally ended the call, a shadow of profound unease creeping over him. He realized Austin wasn't there. He had simply vanished. In our sessions, Derek would later recall that in that first moment, it wasn't true panic he felt, but a deep, jarring sense of cognitive dissonance. A 3-year-old boy, he reasoned, doesn't just evaporate from a penthouse apartment fortified with the best security money can buy, especially with a full staff on hand. And yet, the facts were undeniable. He was gone, whisked away as if by a ghost. Not a single person saw him go. The building security system yielded only one chilling, grainy image: a tiny silhouette walking down a city street, all alone. Derek pulled every string he had, leveraging a decade of influence to flip the city on its head. But the search came up empty. There was not a single, solitary clue as to where his son could be. He must have called Kayla's phone over 100 times, each attempt met by the same soulless, automated voice telling him the number was off. A wave of pure, unadulterated panic was beginning to crest, so he had his assistant, Ryan, dig up the number for Megan, Kayla's best friend. He didn't even bother with a hello when she answered. "This is Derek Hayes. Have you heard from Kayla? If she calls, you tell her. You tell her right now that because of this absurd divorce drama, our son is missing." He pushed forward, his voice strained and cracking under the pressure. "If she has one shred of motherly instinct left in her, she'll be on the very next flight home." Before he could say more, Megan's voice exploded from the receiver. "Wait, back up. Your son is missing. So you call the police, you absolute idiot. What exactly do you think Kayla can do? Does she have some kind of tracking device superpower that works from halfway around the globe? You want her to fly back here and what? Pull him out of a hat? You have completely lost it." And you can stop right there before you even think about blaming this on the divorce. You're the reason she's not here. Honestly, she should have packed her bags and left you and that toxic little terror you're raising years ago. The line went dead. But a second later, his phone vibrated with an incoming call. It was Jessica. When Derek answered, he was assaulted by a cacophony of what sounded like a poorly rehearsed horror film. "Derek, help me. Somebody is trying to— Austin, let him go. Austin, it's all right. Aunt Jessica's here with you. Look out." And then, nothing. The call was cut. Derek immediately had his security team triangulate the signal from Jessica's phone, and they raced across town to the location. What they found felt like a meticulously arranged movie set. There, On a barren patch of dirt by the shoulder of an abandoned highway lay Jessica and Austin, both of them unconscious. Jessica looked like she'd been dragged through a war zone. Her clothes were ripped, and her skin was a mess of dirt and scrapes. But Austin, nestled in her arms in a posture of perfect protective embrace, was immaculate. He didn't have a single scratch on him, except for one small, artful smudge of mud on his cheek. Anyone else walking up to that scene would have seen a courageous hero who had risked her own life. But Derek, standing there and taking in the bizarre tableau, felt his hands clench into tight, calculated fists. He calmly ordered an ambulance to take them both to be checked out. As he stood watching the flashing red and blue lights disappear into the night, he finally turned to his assistant. "I want you to investigate Jessica, a full background report. I want to know every place she's been, every person she's spoken to. I want everything. Don't you dare miss a single detail." Ryan just looked at him, his expression a perfect portrait of confusion for a brief moment, before a cold wave of understanding washed over his features. They had just launched a citywide manhunt with limitless resources and had found absolutely nothing. So how, then, did Jessica, the woman who was supposedly a fragile victim, just happen to find him? More importantly, how does a 3-year-old child manage to outsmart a dozen household staff and bypass a cutting-edge security network? If it had been a real kidnapping, where was the demand for ransom? What kind of professional kidnapper would simply dump their targets by the side of a highway? Derek Hayes had fought his way to the top of the corporate ladder by seeing things others missed. He was nobody's fool, and the plot holes in this story were gaping. It didn't take long for the truth to surface. A short while later, a dossier was placed on Derek's desk. It detailed the entire sequence of events, providing cold, hard proof that Jessica had orchestrated the entire abduction plot herself. He sat and stared at that folder for what felt like an hour. His face an unreadable mask, but you could feel the icy rage radiating off him. "Withdraw the police report," he finally said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion. This entire thing never happened. Shred every page of this file. No one else is ever to know it existed. So, we're just going with the official story that Jessica is the hero who saved Austin? Ryan's disbelief was so thick you could feel it. Any sane person would have been floored. Was Derek actually going to shield the woman who staged the kidnapping of his own child? But before Ryan could form another question, Derek was already moving, striding purposefully down the antiseptic hospital hallway. When he entered the private room, Jessica was propped up on a mountain of pillows, looking as delicate and breakable as a porcelain doll. She winced dramatically as he walked in, a practiced gesture meant to convey immense pain, though he saw a flicker of cold calculation in her eyes. She let out a small, weak cough, subtly shifting her body so a cluster of fresh bruises on her arm was in plain sight. Looking up at him, her brow knit with feigned concern, she asked, "How is Austin? Is he all right? He's just so young." He must have been absolutely terrified. This is all Kayla's fault. Just abandoning her own son like that. What kind of mother just gets up and leaves? She started to perform a show of struggling to get out of the bed, but as she tried to move past him, Derek's hand shot out, his fingers closing around her arm like a vice. His voice was pure ice. "Kayla is my wife, and whether or not she is a good mother is not for you or anyone else to decide." Jessica's eyes flew to Derek's face, a face that looked like it had been chiseled from stone, and she froze completely. The way Derek would later describe that moment in my office will stay with me forever. He said that Jessica's face, which had always looked at him with such gentle, unconditional adoration, was suddenly just blank. It was an unsettling void, an emptiness that was far more chilling than any anger he'd ever seen. He told me he could practically see the sweat beading on her palms as she fought to salvage her role as the victim. Derek, after all this time, how could you possibly call me anyone else? Her voice became soft and wounded, the performance of a lifetime. I was just so worried. I shouldn't have said anything. This was all just so awful. I'm still shaking. I've watched Austin grow up, you know. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. I can't stop myself from worrying about him. Derek explained that this was the exact moment he felt the last of his composure snap. He felt his grip on her arm tighten, a purely instinctual reaction he couldn't control. His eyes were locked on hers, and for the first time since this whole nightmare started, he let her see the glacial suspicion he had been hiding behind a mask of concern. He let the silence hang in the air, thick and heavy, before he finally dropped the bomb he'd been holding. If you thought it was so horrible, so terrifying, then why did you hire someone to abduct my son? Why did you manufacture this entire sick charade? He said her face just seized up, like a statue developing a crack down its center. She just blinked, he recalled, giving a flawless performance of someone utterly bewildered. Derek, what in the world are you talking about? I have no idea what you mean. But he was done playing her games. He told me he didn't even have the energy to present the mountain of proof he had against her. He just held her gaze, letting her feel the full, crushing weight of his disgust and disappointment. I've already handled the evidence for you, he informed her, his voice flat. From this moment on, you will never see Austin again. I'm sending you out of the country. I will make sure you have enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life, but you will never, ever come back. He tried to turn and walk away, right then, to put an end to the whole disgusting affair. But she scrambled out of the hospital bed and wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, her voice breaking with manufactured desperation. Derek, please don't make me leave. If I made a mistake, I can fix it. We've known each other our whole lives. I can't imagine my life without you. He told me it felt like being grabbed by a corpse. Her touch was cold and dead against his back. He just systematically peeled her hands off his waist, feeling absolutely nothing. Her voice, a thin and ragged thread of desperation, filled the sterile silence of the hospital room. Derek, why? She begged, her fingers digging into his arm. Okay, fine, so I was impulsive, I know that. But you and Kayla are finished. The divorce is happening. All I want is to marry the man that I love. Is that really so wrong? I don't care that Austin isn't my biological child. I swear to you, I will be the most amazing mother to him. Derek told me he finally managed to pull his arm away, overcome by a deep, hollow sense of confusion. He just stared at her, utterly lost in the delusion she had built, and repeated her own words back to her in a tone of quiet disbelief. The man you love, the woman you say you love. Derek recalled his own words, telling me they felt like stones in his mouth. You mean my brother, right? My dead brother, Eric? He described watching the life just vanish from Stephanie's face, leaving behind a kind of porcelain doll mask. He said her lips trembled before the words tumbled out, a desperate, disorganized defense. What are you talking about? It's always been you. For years, you were the one here. You were the one who made me feel safe. You remember my birthday when I forget it? You're always the one. He saw in her eyes the raw panic of someone realizing the ground beneath them was never really there. You're kinder to me than you ever were to your own wife, she'd whispered. And he confessed that for a split second, the accusation felt like a physical blow, making him flinch. He had to steady himself, anchoring his mind in the truth. I took care of you, he finally said, his voice clear and precise, cutting through the fog of her fantasy. Because it was the last thing my brother asked me to do. It was a cruel kindness, but a necessary one. I have never loved you that way, Stephanie. I'm not going to marry you. Your private jet is waiting for you now. I really think you should go as soon as you can. He told me he couldn't look at her again. He just turned and walked away, the sound of his shoes on the polished hospital floor echoing the finality of it all. And here's where the universe has a sense of cosmic irony. As Derek's world was quietly shattering in that sterile room, his wife, Megan, was half a world away in Finland, breathing in the clean, cold air, completely unaware. She'd just secured her residency, gotten into a prestigious university, and was finally rebuilding the dream she'd given up for him, her career as a diplomatic translator. Before her classes even started, she'd used the money she'd painstakingly saved, what he later realized was her escape fund, to buy a small, beautiful house just outside the city. He'd learned through secondhand reports from his team that she'd told mutual friends you could see the northern lights dancing right from her backyard on clear nights. She was rediscovering herself in the quiet, in the simple joy of a schedule that was entirely her own, immersing herself in the beautiful complexities of the Finnish language and others. For the first time in more than a decade, she was just herself. To really get the gravity of what he'd lost, you have to see the whole timeline he laid out for me. His wife, Megan, had been accepted into a fiercely competitive international studies program. This was the big leagues. In just 3 years, she was on a fast track to a diplomatic post at the Finnish embassy. He realized, looking at the reports, that she became so absorbed in this new, vibrant life that her old one, the life she'd had as his wife, must have felt like a distant memory, a story about someone else. Because in Finland, she wasn't just a part of the powerful Hayes family dynasty. She wasn't simply the wife of a corporate giant anymore. She wasn't even just Brandon's mom. For the first time since she was a teenager, she was just Megan, a complete person, standing on her own. He explained that the culture in Finland was a world away from the high-pressure society she had left. Life there wasn't a race against time, a checklist of things you had to accomplish by a certain age. It was your own journey. You could work, marry, or travel for years after high school. The choice was yours. The universities, he learned, would hold your spot until you decided you were ready. For Megan, a woman carefully rebuilding her own identity, it was the perfect environment to heal and grow. Many of her classmates were her age or older, each following their own path. For 4 years, the reports he obsessed over painted a picture of a woman finding a deep, profound joy he hadn't known she was missing. She was making real friends. Then, in her 5th year, she did it. Megan became one of the embassy's most valuable diplomatic translators. But here's the part of the story that still gives me chills. During those entire 6 years, she was gone. My client, Derek, never once stopped looking for her. Not for one single day. I was right there in his office, a glass box overlooking the city, when his second in command, David, burst in, practically vibrating. "Sir," he gasped, "we have a positive location on Mrs. Hayes. We've found her. She's at the embassy in Finland." Derek launched out of his chair as if he'd been hit by a defibrillator, and a look of pure, unbridled joy cracked his stoic mask. David's jaw dropped. In the 6 years since Megan had left, none of us had seen that man truly smile. This was a man who orchestrated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, but this news completely undid him. He was already moving, halfway to the door, before he spun back to David, his voice sharp with a new kind of purpose. "Get me a file. I want to know everything about her life. Now." A wave of triumphant energy, of pure victory washed over him. He told me later that for the first time in years, he couldn't stop the smile from spreading across his face. I watched his eyes find the framed photo he kept on his desk, the three of them from another lifetime, and his finger gently traced the outline of Megan's face. He whispered something too low for me to hear, but he told me later it was a promise. "I'm going to fix this. I'm bringing you home." Megan, meanwhile, had built a fortress around her heart, deliberately avoiding all news of him and their son Brandon. That part of her life was over. They had their perfect world, with a perfect society wife she could never be. Her life was a blur of international summits and high-level negotiations, the intense, quiet pressure of translating documents that could alter trade relations. It was exhausting. It was exhilarating. And it was all hers. Until a gray afternoon when her supervisor called her into his office. He was holding a proposal for a new, large-scale energy project. "Megan," he said, his voice serious, "you're the best we have. This is a massive priority for the Finnish Trade Commission. I need this entire binder translated, and I need it done with the highest urgency." He told me that when he finally read this report, he could picture her perfectly. She glanced at the thick document and gave a small, confident smile. "Of course, sir. I'm on it." This was her arena now. She'd spent years training for exactly these kinds of impossible tasks. She lived for the pressure. But then Megan opened the binder, and her gaze fell on the cover page. The proposal was from the Hayes Corporation, and printed right below the logo was the name of the project lead, Derek Hayes. The name, he imagined, must have hit her like a punch to the gut. The report detailed how she physically shook her head, trying to clear the image, taking a ragged breath and telling herself it was just a strange coincidence. Hayes Corp was a global company. It made sense they'd be expanding here. After several sleepless days, she delivered the perfectly translated document to her superior. He flipped through it, his eyebrows climbing his forehead. "This is exceptional work," he said, genuinely impressed. "Your reputation is well deserved. To turn this around so fast with this level of accuracy, Megan, you are absolutely indispensable to this department." From what Derek learned of him, Megan knew this man well. She knew that this level of praise was always the prelude to a uniquely challenging new assignment. Still, the professional affirmation felt good. "Sir, you can skip the flattery," she said with a laugh. "Just tell me what you need. Any more praise and my head won't fit through the doorway." Her boss chuckled. "Point taken. Well, the senior team from Hayes Corp is flying in for a site visit. Our government is rolling out the red carpet for them. I've put you down as the lead diplomatic translator for their entire visit." He then leaned in, a little twinkle in his eye. "And hey, it doesn't have to be all business. I happen to know you're single and the head of their delegation is young, brilliant, and I hear also unattached. You could think of it as a very unique networking opportunity. That, Derek figured, must have been the exact moment a chilling dread began to crawl up her spine. It couldn't be him, she must have thought. The world isn't that small, but it was. Derek then told me about the day he landed in Finland, getting ready for the meetings. He had no idea Megan was even on the same continent, let alone assigned as his team's official translator. He pieced it all together later, of course. On the car ride from her home, her boss was briefing her on the welcome reception, telling her it was informal and that he would personally make the introduction to the lead representative. I can just picture it. Some government official in a suit, seeing Derek emerge from the terminal and starting to wave his arms frantically. Brandon described it to me as the moment the world stopped. Someone was calling his name. Mr. Hayes, over here. And he watched this other man, her boss, actually take Stephanie by the arm and start navigating her through a sea of faces. He could see the complete shock on her face, the way she was trying to orient herself to the sudden ambush. Then, in an instant, 6 years collapsed. She was standing right in front of him, 6 years without a single call, not one message. And it felt, he said, like time had folded in on itself. He looked just as she remembered him, with that same quiet intensity. Her boss, beaming, gave her a gentle push. Mr. Hayes, I'd like you to meet Stephanie Vance from our Diplomatic Translation Division. She's been assigned as your personal translator for this trip. The man then leaned closer, his voice a low, confidential hum. And don't let her delicate looks deceive you. Miss Vance speaks 5 languages fluently. She's our very best. And I believe she's currently single. Brandon told me a primal anger flared up in his chest, so hot he had to physically clench his fist to stop himself from reacting. He could only focus on Stephanie, searching her face for anything beyond professional astonishment. But Stephanie, he remembered, was a master of composure. He watched her construct a perfect civil smile, offer her hand, and speak in a tone that was chillingly polished. Mr. Hayes, it is a pleasure to meet you. Brandon admitted he just stared, his mind completely blank for a moment, before he finally took her hand. The shock of seeing her as this poised, unfamiliar professional was a physical blow he hadn't prepared for. She was already attempting to move the interaction forward, but as she tried to pull her hand away, his fingers wouldn't obey. He simply couldn't break the contact. After she gave a few distinct tugs against his grip, her politeness evaporated, replaced by a steely calm that was far more unnerving. Mr. Hayes, she said, her voice now dangerously low. What exactly do you think you're doing? Her boss, utterly oblivious to the history unfolding before him, finally noticed the shift in atmosphere and tried to smooth it over. Ah, the charm of our translators is truly something. It appears Mr. Hayes is quite taken. Brandon recalled how a cold, silent fury washed over him at the man's foolish comment. His hand finally released hers. He told me that, for the first time that night, he smiled, but it felt unnatural on his face, like a wound. Indeed, was all he could manage, the word tasting like poison. The entire dinner that followed was a masterclass in psychological torture. He could feel Stephanie building walls around herself, trying to categorize him as just another client, a temporary assignment. He knew she was telling herself this couldn't be about her, but she was the sole reason he had traveled halfway across the world. He watched her take her seat beside him, her professional armor flawlessly in place. Finnish is an incredibly complex language, but Brandon said watching Stephanie work was like observing an artist. Her translations were fluid, immediate, capturing the most subtle nuances of business jargon and cultural etiquette with an elegance that left him breathless. He found himself just watching her, completely captivated, trying to reconcile this powerful woman with the girl he'd married. He would state a business point, something clinical like, Finland's policy support for clean energy is exceptional, and their technology is second to none. But market entry requires careful navigation of local regulations. We are prepared to offer legal counsel and dedicate the necessary resources to ensure full compliance. As she translated the sentiment into Finnish, he caught it. A tiny, almost imperceptible pause. He told me he would have sold his soul to know what she was thinking in that split second. In their 5 years of marriage, she had never seen this side of him, the confident, decisive man who could command a room. He wondered if she felt a stab of regret, not for what they'd lost, but for the potential she felt she'd given up. Then a heavier truth landed on him. She was free of him now, and that realization was a constant, twisting ache. His own voice cut through his thoughts, a deliberate attempt to pull her back to him. I need to know about any specific stipulations regarding Finnish tax and labor laws. He described how he intentionally slowed his cadence, making sure his eyes met hers after every word. He was starving for just a glimmer of the woman he knew, a crack in the facade. But she denied him even that. Stephanie's gaze would just slide past him, her attention locking onto the Finnish executives with an unshakable, distant professionalism. To her, he was just another assignment, a file on her desk, no different from the dozens of others she'd handled over the last 6 years. From a corporate standpoint, the dinner was a phenomenal success. Afterwards, as they stood in the silent flurry of a Finnish winter, he watched Stephanie pull her scarf tighter around her neck. She offered a gloved hand, the touch brief and impersonal. Mr. Hayes, it was a pleasure. Good night. And with that, she turned away, the sound of her boots on the snow becoming the loneliest sound he had ever heard in his life. Her hand was already on the handle of the car door when his voice finally broke through his paralysis. Stephanie! He said. She froze, her body going rigid in the falling snow. But she didn't turn around. She simply waited. The wind was biting, stealing the heat from his skin, and his voice came out ragged, roughened by the cold and a much deeper pain. Don't you have anything at all to say to me? He knew how it sounded, desperate, pathetic, but he was far beyond caring about his pride. Her reply was what finally broke him. Mr. Hayes, I believe I translated everything that was required during dinner. As for anything personal, no, there was nothing more to say. In that moment, he told me, the last of his self-control crumbled. He let the raw, pleading need flood his voice, feeling the words fracture as he spoke. Stephanie, when you just left, without a word, even if you weren't thinking about me, about how I'd feel. What about Leo? It's been 6 years, he's 9. Don't you even miss your son? That was the catalyst. She finally turned to face him. And the expression she wore, Brandon said, was the most chilling thing he had ever seen. It was a serene, almost pleasant smile. A child who had zero appreciation for his mother's efforts? What is there to miss exactly? Besides, I'm sure he's quite happy with his new mother by this point. The lie was so perfectly crafted, so cruel, it felt like it sucked all the oxygen out of the air. Snow began to settle on his coat, turning him into a statue of his own failure. He remembered frowning, a deep, painful confusion settling in. He couldn't begin to understand where such cruelty was coming from. A small cloud of condensation formed as he spoke, taking a careful step toward her, his voice deliberately gentle. Leo, he never disrespected you. He was just a little boy. He was too young to understand how to express love. And he is not getting a new mother. His mother will always and only be you. That is not negotiable. Too young to know how to love. He watched her eyes scan his face and knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that she was playing back a story she'd been telling herself for years. It must have been his own mother's birthday that she was thinking of, a day he and Leo always made a big deal of. He realized she had somehow twisted that simple act of love into a personal betrayal. Oh, they knew how to love. He could almost hear her thinking. They just never knew how to love me. He saw her lean against the car, her expression analytical, as if he were a puzzle to be solved. He could feel the weight of her bitter narrative, and it was suffocating. He couldn't bear it. His voice was gravel. "What are you laughing at?" And her smile, he told me. That smile then broke across her face, luminous, beautiful, and aimed directly at his heart like a weapon. That was the final blow. He'd asked what was funny, and in response to that devastating smile, she told him they weren't in a position to share a laugh, that he had no idea who she was anymore, and that she had absolutely no desire to revisit a past he was a part of. Before he could even form a thought, she was in the car, and the door slammed shut with a terrible finality. Then she was gone, leaving him completely shattered in the silent, swirling snow. He told me he spent that night imagining her private torment, and it was its own form of torture for him. He pictured her in some lonely apartment, unable to sleep, haunted by the past he had so carelessly resurrected. Those 5 years they'd spent building a life. He knew he hadn't been a perfect husband, but he never dreamed she saw their life as a prison. For 6 years, she had been abroad, building a new self, and in one evening, he had torn open every old wound. Wife, mother. She had discarded those roles years ago. Seeing him had forced her to confront those ghosts. It was an unbearable weight, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he was the one who had placed it back on her. He imagined her pulling the blankets up to her chin, finally drifting into an exhausted sleep. And then, in the dead of night, a neighbor's dog would start barking, snapping her awake. And the images from her dreams, Brandon's face and the face of their little boy, Leo, would vanish, leaving her alone in the crushing darkness of her room. I've counseled many men who've hit rock bottom, but Brandon's story is one that has stayed with me. He could recall this one part, this beginning of his awakening, with a precision that was haunting because he was the architect of it all. After his wife drove off, he'd made a frantic call, pulled some strings, and gotten her new address. He told me he just stood there for hours under her window, a man hollowed out by a purpose he couldn't name. It was brutally cold, easily 20 or 30 degrees below zero. He could feel his body starting to protest, to shut down, but the thought of leaving was impossible. Then a light switched on. He saw her silhouette, her shape against the warm glow, leaning toward the window to see why her dog was making such a fuss. And he saw the moment her eyes adjusted to the dark and found him. It wasn't anger or fear. It was pure, stark disbelief. The ghost she had fled halfway across the world to escape was standing right on her doorstep. Brandon's ex-wife, Stephanie, was many things, but she wasn't cruel enough to commit murder by inaction. She knew with a certainty that must have felt like a lead weight in her stomach, that if she left him out there, she'd find a human shaped ice sculpture on her porch in the morning. So, filled with a profound sense of dread, she undid the locks and let him stumble inside. The last thing she needed was a visit from the Finnish police, asking why her estranged American ex husband had chosen her welcome mat as his final resting place. Brandon remembered her guiding his shivering frame toward the fireplace, and, with a kind of detached, weary compassion that felt worse than hate, handing him a steaming mug of coffee. That cold, he told me, felt like it had settled deep into his bones. His knuckles were a painful, shocking shade of crimson, and his body was shaking with tremors so violent he could barely get his hands around the warm ceramic. He clutched it like a lifeline, desperate for its heat, and it took a full minute before he could trust himself to speak. When he finally looked at her, he offered a small, fractured smile. "Thank you," he managed to rasp out. Stephanie just stared at him. The gesture was that alien. In the last years of their marriage, Brandon had never smiled at her. He had been a fortress of stoic, unyielding indifference, and that fortress was now visibly crumbling. A sharp line appeared between her eyebrows, her voice colder than the air outside. "Brandon, what on earth are you doing here?" He looked down, and the intricate frost that had crystallized on his eyelashes began to melt in the warmth of the room, gathering into a single perfect droplet. It clung there for a moment, a tiny jewel that made him look impossibly fragile. His lashes quivered, and the drop fell. When he finally raised his eyes to meet hers, his voice was a thin, frozen whisper, carrying the one question that had driven him across an ocean. "I have to know why we got divorced." Stephanie's face remained a perfect, silent mask. He held her gaze, and she must have seen the raw, unvarnished confusion in his eyes, because for her, it was like a dam breaking. He described it as watching a tidal wave of repressed emotion crash over her, a physical blow that seemed to steal her breath. The stark, soul-crushing realization hit her. The 5 years of silent misery, of profound, aching loneliness she had endured, had been so completely invisible to him that he didn't even know they'd happened. A long, shuddering sigh escaped her lips. She never should have opened that door. She should have just turned off the lights and let the unforgiving Finnish winter have him. Her throat felt paper-thin, constricting around a silence that had stretched not just for minutes, but for years. Then, after half a decade, came two words he'd almost never used, not with any real meaning. Stephanie. There was a dark humor in it, a bitter irony that made her eyes sting. The first time he'd ever spoken her name with an ounce of genuine weight behind it was 6 years after their divorce was finalized. She pulled a worn quilt around her shoulders, sinking into an armchair with a look of utter exhaustion. "Brandon," she began, her voice a low, steady thing that defied the tremor in her hands. "Has it ever, for even a moment, crossed your mind that the reason you don't know why we divorced is the exact reason we divorced?" He told me later that her words felt like a punch to the gut. A look of complete system failure washed over his features. That was the Brandon Hayes I came to know, a man whose prestigious family and predatory career had given him an intellect that could dismantle a hostile takeover, but left him utterly deaf to the frequency of a human heart. He moved through life as if the entire universe operated on a complex schedule he alone had written. Stephanie, it turned out, was the first and only character who had ever dared to deviate from his script. She felt that old, familiar burn behind her eyes and had to shift in her seat, swallowing hard. Brandon, before the end, I told you. I laid it all out for you, time and time again. Her voice was quiet, a ghost in the dimly lit room. I said, since you and our son Eric seem to adore Jessica so much, I'll give you what you want. I'll sign the papers. I will even surrender custody of Eric, and I will walk away with absolutely nothing. I told you that our shared assets, every single dime, could be put in a trust for Eric, a final gift from the mother he was slowly being taught to resent. I spoke every one of those words directly to your face. She leaned forward, her eyes pinning him in place. But, Brandon, she asked, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more damning than a shout, do you remember any of it? His knuckles were white, gripping the cheap mug, his brow furrowed as if trying to force a reboot on a mind that had crashed. The absolute, terrifying void in his eyes was her answer. He had no recollection, not a single word. And Stephanie, she had known it. She knew before she even finished the question. In 5 years of marriage, he had never truly listened to a thing she said. To him, she had been a line item in a contract, a high-end nanny for his son, and a convenient placeholder for the times when Jessica, his real emotional center, was unavailable. A knot of pure, acidic frustration tightened deep in her gut. For a fleeting moment, she wanted to hurt him, but the thought died as quickly as it came. You can't wound a man who was never emotionally invested enough to feel pain. His pilgrimage here wasn't about love or loss. It was about an unforeseen error in the otherwise perfect code of his life. He was a man who required total control over every variable. Brandon's head finally fell in a gesture of utter defeat, his voice thick with a strange, hollow apology. I am sorry. I have no memory of that conversation. I must have been overwhelmed with work, but if that's why you left, I simply cannot accept it. Stephanie took a long, slow sip from her cup, the lukewarm coffee a grim anchor in the chaos of the night. A single, incredulous eyebrow arched on her forehead. Oh, you can't accept it? Well, how about this? What about the ghost of another woman's perfume that clung to your suits every single night you came home? Is that an acceptable reason for you? Brandon's expression froze, the gears in his hyper-logical mind grinding to a halt as he searched for a rebuttal. He found nothing. He just shook his head, as if the idea itself was an absurdity. Jessica, he said, his voice laced with genuine disbelief. You divorced me over Jessica? The raw astonishment in his tone was a marvel. It was as if leaving him over his blatant emotional affair with Jessica was a concept even more alien than leaving him for being a complete phantom in his own home. Stephanie took another slow sip of coffee and gave a small, deliberate nod. She's the one. You came home smelling of her signature scent every day for years. Our son Eric would talk endlessly about how he wished his Aunt Jessica could be his real mommy. Was I supposed to just stay? She pressed, and fight for the hollow title of Mrs. Hayes, a title for a life I never even wanted in the first place? Brandon's face was ashen. So, you believed I was having an affair? Stephanie held up a single finger, wagging it slowly. No, it was long past believing. It was when you started bringing Jessica to every company dinner, every charity event, and never once corrected anyone when they mistakenly introduced her as your wife. It was when your colleagues started making jokes about it, right in front of me, about what a perfect couple you and Jessica made. It was when you signed our divorce papers without a second glance because you were rushing to a meeting with her. At that point, whether you were physically cheating or not had become completely irrelevant. Divorcing you, she told him, her eyes locking onto his, was my decision not to suffocate inside the gilded cage you had built around me. Nobody wants to live their entire life as a performance piece, Brandon. To be so defined by appearances and what other people think that you forget who you really are. I was becoming that hollow woman, and that was a fate I would never, ever choose for myself. Brandon's eyes blinked slowly. He was quiet for a very long time. Perhaps he had never imagined she could be so brutally honest. More likely, her feelings were simply unexpected data points he was struggling to process, looking for the flaw in his original equation so he could perfect the next one. From Stephanie's perspective, it was also pointless. His devotion to Jessica was absolute, a simple, undeniable fact of his existence. He remembered her birthday with elaborate, thoughtful gifts. He would cancel a board meeting or scuttle a multi-million-dollar project to be at her side if she called. He absorbed every word she said, cataloging her every preference. His all-consuming focus on Jessica meant this spectacular failure with Stephanie would have no real impact on his life going forward. It was just a glitch to be patched. I often work with people at their absolute lowest, but Brandon's story has stayed with me. He first described to me a scene that played out at 4:30 in the morning. He said that if things were different, the alarm would have been just 30 minutes from blasting. The signal for Stephanie to start making breakfast for him and their son, Eric. He could almost feel the ghost of that old, weary life settle over her as she stood in the doorway, the pre-dawn air chilling the room. "Brandon," she'd said, her voice flat, "I've told you everything you wanted to know. It's time for you to go. I need to get some sleep." Just as she finished speaking, he managed to push out the two words he'd been struggling with all night. They were quiet, but they landed with the weight of years. "I'm sorry." He watched her freeze, her hand still on the door. He made sure to hold her gaze, trying to pour every ounce of sincerity he had into his eyes, and he repeated it, drawing out each syllable. "I'm sorry, I honestly never saw it. I never understood that my blindness was causing you so much pain. I was so wrong. I apologize." And for a split second, something completely unexpected happened. A sharp, disbelieving bark of a laugh escaped her. In all the years he'd known her, he'd never seen Stephanie react like that. He told me later it was as if he'd broken some fundamental law of the universe by offering a genuine apology. But right after that single, harsh laugh, he saw a profound ache surface on her face, a shadow of an old agony. He was finally beginning to understand that it took him laying out their entire 5-year history like a sterile case file to even begin to recognize the depth of her suffering. He watched her press a hand to her chest, and he imagined the tangled knots of resentment he'd placed there might finally be starting to loosen. He allowed himself a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of closure. "But there's one thing you have wrong," he said, and he saw that fragile peace instantly shatter. Her eyes widened. He set his jaw, needing to correct the one accusation he couldn't bear. "I never cheated on you, Stephanie, and I am not and was never in love with Jessica." The sadness that flooded him was so immense it was a physical weight. "She was my brother Michael's fiancée. I took care of her, gave her whatever she needed because it was the last thing he ever asked of me." He tried to explain the twisted logic that had governed his actions for years. The only reason I never said anything, he confessed, his voice thickening with the grief he'd carried for so long. When people got your last name wrong, was because I always felt that if Michael had lived, you would have been his. You belonged with him. But Stephanie just gave a small, tired wave of her hand, a gesture of complete dismissal. It's irrelevant now, Brandon. That detachment, he told me, felt like a physical blow. He pushed forward, desperate. No, it isn't. For the 6 years you've been gone, Eric and I, we have missed you more than words can say. I have to fix this, he remembered pleading, a raw desperation in his voice he didn't recognize himself. I have to make you understand, so you'll come back to us. So you'll finally come home. For a moment, she just stared at him as if he were speaking another language. This was a woman who had spent a decade fighting her way out of the life he had built around her. And here he was, the architect of that cage, asking her to willingly walk back inside. A tiny tremor of a laugh started. Then it swelled, and it kept growing until Stephanie was doubled over, howling with the wild, heartbreaking sound of a person whose soul was finally and irrevocably free. When Brandon first recounted that moment to me, the look on his face was one of pure, lingering bewilderment. He couldn't grasp what she found so funny. It was a fundamental disconnect, a chasm so wide, it was as if he was truly seeing the woman he'd married for the very first time. He described how she had to clutch her stomach, tears streaming down her face from a laugh that sounded more like a painful purge of old ghosts. It was a full minute before she could gasp for air. "Brandon," she said, her voice still ragged, "are you serious? It took every single piece of me to get away from you." To make sense of his shock, you have to understand what he told me happened the night before. He'd shown up at her new apartment, a place that smelled of fresh paint and the kind of quiet independence he'd never allowed her, and begged her to come home. Her reaction was immediate and fierce. "I have my own life now, Brandon," she'd said, her voice tight with anger. "A career. Why would I ever go back to being Eric's unpaid nanny or your personal courier driving that awful clam chowder to your office every single day? I get that you feel guilty about Michael. I know you're trying to honor his memory by raising his daughter, Chloe, but that's your responsibility." He told me she just let it all out, with a clarity that was as stunning as it was brutal. "So, why are you trying to chain me to your family's grief? I don't owe Michael anything. I have no obligation to his daughter. And I certainly don't owe you anything anymore." He tried to interrupt, to say anything to stop the torrent. But she was unstoppable. She walked to the door and pulled it open. Brandon described a blast of frigid air and snow that instantly chilled the room, a cold that mirrored the absolute ice that had formed around her heart. With her hand gripping the doorknob, her voice dropped to a register as cold as the blizzard outside. "Get out! And don't ever make me say it again." And so, he left, but he was convinced that for Stephanie, the night was far from over. He imagined her completely wrecked, too emotionally drained to sleep, just staring at the ceiling until dawn before forcing herself to go to her job at the embassy. But when she arrived, she was met with news that he later realized must have felt like a cruel twist of the knife. Her supervisor called her into his office, his face serious. "Stephanie," he said, "you're new, but your ambition and talent are undeniable. This new energy project with the Walker Corporation is a major step in diplomatic relations for our countries. Because of that, our senior leadership team will be touring their U.S. headquarters with Mr. Walker himself. Of course, Mr. Walker was Brandon. Then, the supervisor delivered the final, crushing piece of the puzzle. We'll need an interpreter for the trip, and I've already put your name forward. You haven't been home in 6 years, Stephanie. This is a perfect chance for you to visit your family. She stood there. He imagined, a perfect hollow smile on her face as her private world collapsed. She must have known immediately it was his doing. The moment he'd re-entered her life, the peace she'd fought so hard for was sucked back into a storm of his making. But what could she do? Stephanie was nothing if not a professional. She simply straightened her shoulders like a soldier accepting orders. You can count on me, sir. I will ensure the mission is a success. That same afternoon, she was on a private jet, flying back to the United States with Brandon and the entire diplomatic corps. He confessed to me later, with no small amount of shame, that he had personally arranged the seating chart to put her right next to him. It's not hard to picture the tension in that cabin. Stephanie, pinching the bridge of her nose, looking utterly spent as she stared out the window, finding a blank canvas in the clouds to avoid looking at him. They were both running on no sleep, but Brandon, he always had a way of looking impeccably put together. Shortly after takeoff, he gently draped a heavy blanket over her. He told me he moved with the caution of someone trying to disarm a live wire, terrified to break the fragile silence. But he knew she wasn't sleeping. She was miles away. He knew she couldn't stand the sight of him. In her eyes, he was the man she had once loved completely, but he had also become the warden of her own private prison. Their divorce had been a clean cut, a surgical procedure to remove that entire chapter of her life. What she couldn't have possibly prepared for, however, was that getting off that plane meant she would see the son with whom she now shared only a biological link. And there he was, Eric. He was waiting in the arrivals area, his small hand lost in his grandmother's. At 9 years old, he was no longer the toddler she'd left. He was a lanky, unfamiliar boy. His eyes were puffy and red, and the second he saw Stephanie, a raw, desperate cry cut through the quiet airport. "Mom!" Brandon saw the Finnish diplomats shoot each other confused, uncomfortable looks, their whispers barely audible. But Stephanie's composure was a fortress. She kept a placid smile on her face as she responded in perfect, flowing Finnish. "Oh, that poor little boy. He seems to have mistaken me for his mother." Standing beside her, Brandon's face went rigid. He understood every word. He knew precisely what she had just done in front of his colleagues. Eric tried to run to her, but his grandmother, Eleanor, held him back with a grip like steel. The older woman had too much pride to let the scene escalate in public. He watched his own mother turn and lead the heartbroken boy away in a quiet, devastating defeat. Brandon admitted to me that Eleanor's appearance wasn't a coincidence. It had been a coordinated, tactical move to corner Stephanie. But Stephanie was no longer a player in their games. The next week was a unique form of torture for Brandon as he guided the delegation through Walker Corp. He played the part of the flawless host, but he told me that every evening, as soon as his duties were done, he would seek her out, unable to let the raw wound of that airport confrontation begin to heal. "Kayla," Austin told me, he begged her during a tense meeting that week, his voice cracking with a desperation he rarely showed. "The last of the estate duties are almost done. Can you please just come home with me? At least come see Derek. He never stops asking for you, sweetheart. He's hurting. He misses his mom." When he said that, he told me a sound escaped her like the shattering of a precious frozen thing, a bitter, brittle laugh. All she saw, she said, was a miniature version of Austin's own face, contorted in that same angry, rejecting way he'd looked at her for years. She just gave a sharp shake of her head. I have a very hard time believing that. He never wanted me then. After 6 years, he must genuinely hate me. He always said he wished Jessica was his real mom. And then came the blow that leveled him. You're so fixated on honoring your brother's final wishes, aren't you? She said, her voice dangerously quiet. So, why don't you just marry her? It's the perfect arrangement for everybody. And it would save whatever woman you end up with from the awkward job of helping you raise your sister-in-law. The wall of composure Austin had painstakingly built around himself finally crumbled into dust. He squeezed the bridge of his nose, and gesture of such profound exhaustion it seemed to pain him, and released a long, shuddering breath. Kayla, do we have to talk to each other like this? Her eyes were glacial. You don't like hearing it. In that case, we don't have to talk at all. With that chilling finality, she gathered her purse and coat and walked directly out of the cafe, retreating back into the sterile silence of her hotel room. Her own family felt like strangers now. There was no comfort for her there. But then, a single pinprick of light broke through the suffocating darkness. She got a text that her best friend from college, Chloe, was in town for a conference, and a genuine warmth spread through her chest for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She made the call, and they agreed to meet right away. The moment they locked eyes across the restaurant, Chloe's face erupted into a brilliant, beaming smile. She grabbed Kayla's hands, pulling her into an exuberant spin. This! Look at you! This is it! This is the Kayla I remember. It's been 6 long years, my friend. But to see you standing here, on your own, so completely free, I am just so incredibly happy for you. It's always like that with old friends, isn't it? The conversation picked up as if no time had passed, and the hours simply dissolved. But right in the middle of their joyful reunion, Kayla's phone started to vibrate insistently on the table. It was a local number, one she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail, but it rang again, immediately. With a sigh, she answered. A stressed, unfamiliar woman's voice came crackling through the line. And in that instant, her fragile new world began to fracture. Hello? Is this Derek Walker's mother? This is his teacher from school. Derek was in a fight with another student today. I tried reaching his father and, well, he told me to call you. Before Kayla could even process the words, Chloe, ever the fierce protector, had leaned across the table and plucked the phone from her hand. You've got the wrong number, she stated in a clipped, non-negotiable tone, and ended the call. What is wrong with Austin? You two are divorced. You don't even have custody of Derek. You haven't even been in the country a full week, and he's already dumping his problems back on you. But before Chloe could finish her impassioned defense, the phone was buzzing again. It was the same teacher, and any hint of politeness was gone from her voice. When Kayla answered, the woman's words were sharp as flint. Mrs. Walker, I am insisting that you come to the school this instant. Your son's well-being cannot be compromised by your personal disputes. Furthermore, Derek hit the other boy hard enough that he's going to need stitches. Austin told me about the call he got from the principal, about the man's strained official voice on the other end. The other students' parents are here, the principal had explained, and they are insisting that you come down here to manage the situation and get your son to a hospital. That was the tipping point. Kayla had no way out. When they both arrived at the principal's office, the scene was pure chaos. A small group of rumpled elementary school boys were huddled in one corner, and each one had a parent hovering protectively beside them, all except Derek. He was standing completely, heartbreakingly alone. The injured boy's mother had a fierce arm around her son, and she was pointing an accusatory, trembling finger straight at Derek, her voice a furious storm. "What is the matter with you?" The woman's voice was a knife, slicing through the thick, tense air of the principal's office. "Hitting another child like that? Did nobody ever teach you how to behave?" Austin told me that before she could even finish, a nasty little snicker rippled through the other kids. The energy in the room soured immediately. "Derek doesn't have a mom," one of them supplied, his tone thick with the casual cruelty of the playground. "His mom just left him." Another one twisted the knife. "Yeah, Derek's a weirdo with no mother." My heart still breaks when I think about it. Austin said a deep, painful red flush crept up his son's neck. He looked like a cornered animal, all coiled instinct and raw fury, ready to lash out and restart the very fight he'd already lost. It wasn't a secret that Austin's family had invested a significant amount of money in Derek's martial arts training, but this was an entirely different kind of fight. The office was packed with the other parents who had formed a solid wall to defend their children. Derek was completely outnumbered. As they crowded him, he stumbled backward and fell hard onto the scuffed tile floor. When he looked up, his entire world came to a halt. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the hallway light, was Kayla. Austin told me he saw his son's eyes flash a wild, desperate red. Tears welled, threatening to spill over, but the boy bit his lips so fiercely it was a miracle it didn't bleed, wrenching his head away as he scrambled back onto his feet. Austin recalled how Kayla met Derek's wounded gaze with a chillingly detached calm, completely disregarding his son's desperate attempt to look tough. She swept into the room, her eyes gliding over the hostile faces of the other adults, her very presence seeming to thin the air. Her introduction was a study in surgical precision. "I am Derek Walker's biological mother," she announced, her voice perfectly level and cold. "His father and I are divorced, and I do not have legal custody. For any issues of financial liability, you will need to speak with his father, Austin Walker." Every single word was a carefully laid brick, building an impenetrable wall between her and the emotional wreckage in that office. "It was," Austin said, "an utterly devastating thing to witness." At the clear sound of her voice, Derek's head snapped toward her, his expression a perfect picture of shattered disbelief. Austin said his son must have felt the weight of Kayla's indifferent stare, because the boy immediately and furiously swiped at his eyes, terrified she would see the tears that proved his weakness. The irony was suffocating. Wasn't Derek the one who had screamed for a divorce, who had begged for this very separation? Why was he falling apart now? But the second she said the name Austin Walker, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. The other parents shot nervous looks at each other, their righteous anger suddenly evaporating like mist. The name Austin Walker was a brand, a name you saw on the cover of business magazines. You'd have to be completely off the grid not to recognize it. A schoolyard scuffle was nothing, a minor inconvenience that could have been handled with a single discreet phone call. But Austin, he confessed to me in one of our sessions, had made a calculated, deeply desperate play. He had deliberately thrown this crisis at Kayla, hoping to ignite some forgotten spark of maternal instinct. He had forgotten that love, even a parent's love, is not an unconditional guarantee. It has to be nurtured, and theirs had been starved for years. Kayla took a slow, deliberate inhale, and for just a fraction of a second, Austin saw a dark flicker in her eyes, a haunted look that reminded him so much of her own father. One of the other dads finally cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "Mrs. Walker, even if you and Mr. Walker are divorced, your son needs to account for his actions." Kayla gave a curt, dismissive nod, her eyes barely making contact with Derek. "Why did you hit him?" Derek's chin shot out, a silent, stubborn wall of defiance. Whatever maternal patience she might have had once, the gentleness required to coax the truth from a wounded child was long gone. Austin could see that life had scoured it clean out of her. "If you're not going to talk," she stated, her voice utterly flat, "then you can sit here and wait for your father. I have another appointment. I don't have time for this." Those words were the final spark in the powder keg. The boy exploded. Like a wounded creature turning on its own, Derek locked his blazing eyes on his mother and screamed the very words that had ignited the fight in the first place. "They said I don't have a mother." "Are you happy now?" he shrieked, all the pain and confusion of the last 6 years erupting in one raw, unfiltered torrent. "Why didn't Dad just marry Aunt Jessica? She would never treat me like this. I hate you. I hate you so much." Austin told me Kayla just stood there, an unmoving statue, and let the hurricane of his pain wash over her. When he was finally spent, she simply raised a single eyebrow. "When your father and I were still married, you were the one screaming that you wanted Jessica to be your mother. I might have understood this reaction then, but we are divorced now. If you want a mother so badly, perhaps you should go find one for yourself." A poisonous ripple of whispers immediately spread through the watching parents. Can you believe that? A child that young, already trying to break up his parents' marriage. It's no wonder she couldn't take it anymore. That's Jessica Evans, right? The model? I've seen her with Mr. Walker at charity events. I honestly thought she was his wife. Turns out she was just the mistress. At his age, Derek was an emotional sponge, and he absorbed every last toxic syllable. He couldn't stand it for another second. He spun around to run from the office to escape the crushing weight of their judgment, but he only made it 2 steps before he froze in place. Austin had arrived. Flanked by his personal assistant and 2 large security guards, he completely filled the doorway. His face, he told me later, was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He radiated an intensity that seemed to compress the small room, sucking the air out until it became difficult to breathe. When Nathan first came to see me, this was the scene he kept returning to, the moment the ground gave way beneath his feet. He described his best friend's house as a war zone of emotions, with him standing at the epicenter. His son Leo was a small, silent statue of misery, his gaze locked on the floor as if the answers were written there. I could tell Nathan felt a surge of his usual authority, the kind that made other adults in the room falter. But it was useless against Ashley, his ex-wife. He recalled her eyes, not angry, but chillingly resolute. "You're here," she'd stated. A fact, not a welcome. She told him their son, as his legal responsibility, was now entirely his problem. And with that, she pivoted and walked away, a clean break, leaving the sound of her friend Megan's frantic calls echoing in the sudden quiet. What he couldn't have grasped in that moment of confusion was the conversation happening just moments later, the poison being dripped into Ashley's ear by Megan. He learned later, through fragmented accounts, how Megan had twisted the narrative in the car. "That child is a monster," she'd spat, painting a picture of a boy completely out of control. In Megan's telling, Leo hadn't been sad. He'd been hysterical, screaming that he wished that other woman, Chloe, was his real mom. The lie deepened, with Megan claiming Nathan had struck his own son, that Leo had tried to bolt. The final, cruelest invention was that Chloe had appeared like an angel to soothe the boy. It was a calculated assassination of character, and at the time, Nathan was completely defenseless against it. In a painfully predictable turn, Ashley and Megan sought refuge in the bottom of a glass at some dark, quiet bar. But, as Nathan recounted to me, some problems can't be outrun. When they finally emerged, hours later, into the fading light, he was there. He described the ache in his arm from holding Leo's hand for what felt like an eternity, the two of them a small, waiting island of shared misery. The instant his gaze connected with Ashley's across the pavement, he told me it felt like a physical blow, extinguishing the last ember of hope he'd been clinging to. The possibility of fixing this, whatever this was, felt suddenly and completely out of reach. Ashley, he remembered saying, the single word feeling like a boulder in his throat. We have to talk. For a man like Nathan Hayes, accustomed to shaping the world to his will, the memory of that plea was particularly sharp. To his surprise, Ashley simply instructed Megan to get a ride and then slipped into the back of his car. He described the ride as one of the most suffocating experiences of his life. Leo was a silent silhouette in the passenger seat, while he and Ashley were separated by a chasm of silence in the back. The quiet was so absolute, so loaded with resentment, he became fixated on the sound of the driver's breathing, a man trying desperately to fade into the upholstery. The car eventually came to a smooth stop before a restaurant so exclusive it felt like a fortress. As a valet rushed forward, Nathan made a clumsy, desperate gesture, an attempt to open her door, an olive branch. She bypassed him without a flicker of acknowledgement. He described standing there, his hand still outstretched in the empty air, the public rejection stinging more than he could have anticipated. Then, the second blow landed as he recognized the place. It was the very restaurant he had failed to reserve for her birthday 6 years ago, a wound he had no idea was still so fresh. 6 years. It was, he admitted, a catastrophic failure of love on his part. He recalled how she had begged him to celebrate with her, just the two of them, a plea he had met with a wall of indifference. A few days later, he'd rented out the entire place for Chloe, a grand gesture for the wrong woman. Now, here he was, finally making the move she had once so deeply desired, but the gesture was hollow, an echo arriving years too late. Ashley sat, her posture rigid, and dispensed with any niceties. If you have something to say, Nathan, just say it. But let's get two things straight right now, she added, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. I'm not discussing custody, and we are not getting back together. With two swift sentences, she had preemptively dismantled his entire unformed plan. He felt a muscle jump in his jaw as his brain struggled to recalibrate. From a psychological standpoint, he was completely disarmed. Across from them, little Lau stared at his mother, his eyes swollen and pleading, searching for a softness that was no longer there, a warmth that had been extinguished. So Nathan finally asked the question that had haunted the quiet moments for years, the central mystery of his failed marriage. Ashley, if you hated me this much, why did you ever say yes? Why did you marry me? In that moment, he confessed to her his own profound delusion, that He genuinely believed she was the perfect partner, the ideal Mrs. Hayes. For a brief second, he let his own guard down, and the raw hurt was visible on his face. But his words, meant to draw her closer, instead triggered something deep within her. He watched, helpless, as she physically recoiled, as if his voice had summoned a ghost. It was no use. The past was sitting with them at the table, a cold and heavy presence. She took a sip of water, a small gesture to steady a world that was tilting off its axis. Then she delivered the words that would demolish his reality. "If you had been sent to a place," she started, her voice barely a whisper but shaking with intensity, "a school where they broke you, locked you in pitch-black rooms for days, punished every flicker of your own personality, and your only path to freedom was to become the perfect high society wife, you would have said yes, too, wouldn't you?" He just stared, he told me, completely lost. The words made no sense. It was a narrative from a life he knew nothing about. A dry, broken laugh escaped her. "Did you honestly think I didn't like to learn? I was at the top of my class my entire life." And then the dam broke. She laid out the entire horrific truth. How at 16, his family had scouted her like a prize thoroughbred. How at 18, for the simple crime of having a boyfriend, of wanting a normal life, they had sent her to that private psychological prison. They released her on their wedding day. She confessed that, even now, years later, the memory was a place her mind couldn't go without shattering into a million pieces. No. Ashley's voice was a raw whisper. Yet, it carried the force of a final judgment that silenced the entire restaurant around them. "I don't want to be your wife, Nathan. Not 6 years in the past, and definitely not now." She spoke of how she had tried, how she had clung to the hope of forging a real family from the arrangement. "But you too," she said, her gaze pinning him to his seat, lumping him in with his mother's cruelty. "You personally destroyed that dream. You made me realize the Hayes name isn't a family. It's a beautifully decorated prison. It would have consumed what was left of me if I hadn't found a way out." "The greatest kindness you can offer me now," she went on, her tone eerily calm, as if she had moved beyond pain into some cold, empty space, "is to disappear from my life and never come back. And this place, God, Nathan, after everything, just breathing the air in this room makes me physically ill." He watched, paralyzed, as she picked up her bag and walked away, leaving him in the ruins. But as she reached for the door, some primal, desperate instinct in him broke through the shock. In a voice he didn't recognize as his own, he called out, "I'm sorry, I swear to God I didn't know. But please, I just need to ask you something." He was utterly exposed, stripped of all the armor his name and money had always provided. "You said you wanted a happy life with me," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Was any of that real? Did you ever care for me at all? Was there ever any love? And if there was, is there any chance, even the smallest one, that we could start over?" But Ashley didn't even pause. She didn't look back. She simply opened the door and vanished, leaving him with nothing but the crushing silence. He had no way of knowing that her past was literally on its way to her, and by morning, her father would be standing at her hotel door. "My dearest Ashley," Spencer Miller began with a smile that was all mechanics and no warmth, a performance Nathan knew all too well. "Where have you been all this time? Why wouldn't you return your father's calls?" Ashley just observed him, he learned later, noting the new gray hairs at his temples and feeling a confusing vortex of old fear and new strength. The man whose disapproval could once shatter her world now seemed diminished, almost pathetic in his attempt at charm. It's a profound shift, Nathan came to understand, when you realize the monsters of your youth were just deeply flawed people all along. "Mr. Miller," she replied, and the formality was a weapon, a declaration that their old relationship was dead. "If you have a reason for being here, I suggest you state it. I'm done playing your games." The surprise on Spencer's face was total. This cold, controlled woman was not the daughter he remembered. His practiced smile faltered. "Well," he sputtered, trying to recover, "it's just been so long. I thought perhaps you might join us for a family dinner." "You know," her father continued, regaining his transactional footing, "Nathan has become a vital part of the family business while you've been away. It's obvious he's still devoted to you. The way you two ended things was so messy. Now that you're back, it seems like the perfect time for our families to properly reconnect." And then he delivered the line that illuminated everything. "After all, you were promised to him since you were 16 years old." In that one sentence, Ashley understood. This visit, this fake concern, it had nothing to do with her. Her own smile was now just as manufactured as his, but hers was sharp. "So, what you're suggesting is a merger, that Nathan and I should remarry." Her father's head bobbed in eager agreement, a flash of avarice in his eyes. She let out a short, hollow laugh. "Tell me, what did the Hayes family offer you this time, Dad? A new contract? A major project to prop up your company? If Miller Industries is in such dire straits that you need to sell your daughter again to save it, then maybe it deserves to fail." And with that final truth spoken aloud, his entire charade collapsed. "You run away for a few years and suddenly you're better than us? Is that how you talk to your father?" He snarled, his voice thick with fury. Then came the real reason for his visit, the wounded core of his narcissism. If somebody hadn't been filling Nathan's ear with nonsense about that ridiculous school, he never would have pulled every last one of his investments out of our company overnight. I remember Brandon telling me how his father-in-law's voice was a low growl, vibrating with a fury that seemed to shake the room. "Our net worth was sliced in half overnight," Spencer had seethed, his face a twisted mask of indignation. "You are coming with me to see him, and that's the end of it?" When he lunged for Stephanie's arm, she tore it away with a violence that shocked even Brandon. In that moment, he saw it wasn't just anger. It was the desperate, final act of a woman excising a cancer. An hour later, he was sitting in the oppressive silence of his father-in-law's mansion. His own son, Eric, shifting uncomfortably beside him as Stephanie walked in. Brandon recalled the look on Stephanie's face, a chillingly blank, detached expression he hadn't seen in years, not since the worst of their last days together. She moved past them as if they were nothing more than obstacles in a room, sinking into a distant armchair. He tried to speak, his voice barely a whisper, a desperate attempt to bridge the chasm between them. "Stephanie, I only came here today because—" A glare from her, so sharp and icy it cut him off mid-sentence, stopped his heart. "Why you're here is completely irrelevant to me. In fact, the single most constructive thing you could do is get up and walk out that door." It felt, he said, like a physical blow, knocking all the air from his chest. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with years of unspoken pain. Brandon bless his heart, tried one last time to reach her. "I'm not trying to force anything on you," he started. "I just—" He was cut off by Spencer, bustling in with a bottle of scotch that probably cost more than Brandon's first car. "Here we go, a little something to smooth things over," he announced, pouring a heavy glass for Brandon. "Stephanie's always had a flair for the dramatic. Don't you give it a second thought. I've already set her straight." "She's back to build a real future with you, Brandon," Spencer continued, the fake sincerity in his voice making Brandon's stomach turn. "I was telling her we should start planning a new wedding ceremony, something tasteful." He was practically bowing, a parody of a gracious host trying to seal a business deal. In that moment, Brandon finally understood. To Spencer, Stephanie wasn't his daughter. She was leverage. She was a valuable asset he was trying to liquidate to save his own skin. But Brandon, the supposed grand prize in this whole humiliating spectacle, couldn't say a word. He was completely frozen, a prisoner in this surreal nightmare. His father-in-law pushed again, his voice now thin with a raw, unconcealed desperation. "Brandon, I get it. You're still upset she ran out on you 6 years ago. We can make the new wedding small. Hell, we don't need a wedding. Just, for God's sake, I'm begging you, just take her back. What do you say?" The answer didn't come from Brandon. It came from the front door, which was suddenly thrown open with a percussive, explosive crack. "I'd say absolutely not," a powerful voice boomed, echoing off the high ceilings. "What decade do you think this is? You're brokering a marriage like it's a merger, and you have the audacity to try and poach a senior official from my State Department?" A team of men in dark, severe suits and earpieces flowed into the room, their movements economical and unnervingly professional. Following them was an older man with snow-white hair and the unmistakable air of someone who wielded absolute authority. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, took in every detail of the scene. Now, Spencer Walker might have been a master of corporate manipulation, but even he knew what it meant when a man arrived with his own federal security team. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. He stumbled forward, his head bowed. "Sir, I'm not sure what this is about, but it's a tremendous honor to have you in my home." The older man gave a short, dismissive laugh. In 1950, the national marriage law explicitly abolished the feudal practice of coerced and arranged marriages. And in 1992, he went on, his voice ringing with institutional power, the Violence Against Women Act was passed to outlaw this exact kind of domestic coercion. Yet, here you are, having forcibly brought a State Department diplomat to your home to strong-arm her into a marriage. Are you intentionally trying to turn back the clock 50 years in a single afternoon? Spencer Walker stood there, rigid as a statue. And it wasn't just him. Every single person in that room, Brandon and young Eric included, was staring, completely and utterly thunderstruck. "State Department? Sir, there must be a mistake. This is a private family matter," Spencer stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "My daughter, she never even finished her bachelor's degree. How could she possibly work for the State Department? She's a housewife. She left after a silly argument." Before he could dig his hole any deeper, two of the agents moved in and efficiently put him in restraints. In the ringing silence that followed, Stephanie finally stood, dabbing a single tear from her cheek. For the first time all night, she looked at Brandon, and he saw something that wasn't anger or indifference, but a profound, aching pity. She had arranged for a car to pick him up the moment he'd arrived, a quiet acknowledgement that she knew this was the only way it could end. "The car's waiting, Brandon," she said, her voice finally losing its hard edge. "I am so sorry it took you 6 years to understand that we were divorced. Please, just go home." The story Brandon eventually unspooled for me was a quiet tragedy of misdirection and misunderstanding. It was his story, but it was also Stephanie's. The story of a woman forced to make an impossible choice. He learned later that at her job, she wasn't just an employee, she was a rising star. Her boss, a man named Director Vance, saw her brilliance. He once told her, "Stephanie, you have the sharpest analytical mind I've seen in 20 years, and you speak 5 languages. If any man ever tries to reduce you to a housewife, I will personally burn his world down. Women like you are meant to run the world, not be chained to a kitchen." And Director Vance meant every word. He'd often say, "A person's right to choose their own partner is fundamental, but this kind of patriarchal coercion is something we will not tolerate." So when Vance had called her and said, "Miss Walker, I'm ending your family leave early. I hope that's not an issue," an incredible wave of relief had washed over her. Brandon learned she just shook her head, a real smile finally breaking through her composure. "No, sir. Honestly, I've been counting the days until I could come back." The old director just gave her a small, knowing nod. Then came the evening that shattered Brandon's reality. A black government sedan had pulled up to the Walker estate, flanked by 2 local police cars. As Stephanie escorted Director Vance out, she watched in what felt like a slow-motion film as uniformed officers approached her father with an arrest warrant. The charges listed on it were a gut punch Brandon would never forget. Credible evidence suggests the finishing school attended by Stephanie Walker was a front for illegal confinement, systematic abuse, and severe psychological manipulation. It all began, as so many of Brandon's traumatic memories did, with a shattered family dinner. When a state official said, "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," the civilized facade of their life imploded. Her father, Spencer, erupted in a storm of furious denial, screaming his innocence at people who were no longer listening. The beautiful dining room became a war zone of emotion. Stephanie was almost to the waiting car, her boss holding the door, when a tiny, broken voice cut through the chaos. "Mom!" Her knuckles went white on the cold handle. Her director held her gaze, a lifetime of understanding passing between them, before he gave one firm, final nod. "This work demands everything," he had warned her, his voice low and serious. "You'll be thousands of miles away for years at a time. You won't see them. It will be a cleaner break for everyone if you make peace with it now." With that, he slipped into the car and was gone, leaving her alone on the curb to face her husband, Brandon, and their son, Eric. The boy's small hand was clenched in his father's, his eyes wide with tears he was desperately trying to hold back, his little chin tilted defiantly at the sky as if demanding an answer from it. And then Eric, with the simple, devastating honesty only a child has, twisted the knife that was already in his mother's heart. "Do you not want to be my mom anymore?" His lower lip trembled. "You don't want me?" he whispered, the words barely audible. "Dad and me, we missed you so much. For years. I see him sometimes, just staring at your picture in his office for hours. What I said back then? I was just a kid. I didn't understand. Can you forgive me, Mom? Please? Can you love me again?" As Brandon recounted this to me, he explained that watching her listen to those words, he saw a wave of pure, crushing sorrow wash over her, so immense he thought it might pull her right under. As a counselor, I tried to help Brandon understand the impossible position Stephanie was in. This was the child she had carried, the baby she had almost died giving birth to. Her love for him was primal, a biological need to protect him. But how do you hold close the very person who, in your darkest moment, sided with your abuser? In the cold, sterile silence of that mansion, when everything was on the line, her own son had chosen. He just hadn't chosen her. And that, I explained to Brandon, is a kind of wound, a betrayal so deep that some people never fully heal from it. Brandon told me she finally acknowledged she could forgive them, not for their sake, but for her own peace. But the very foundation of their family had been declared unsalvageable. The damage was now a permanent part of the structure. He recounted a scene that was seared into his memory, watching Stephanie look at their son, Eric, with an expression so unnervingly calm it felt terrifying. "You and I," she began, her voice soft, "we never truly had our time together. For the first few years, you were just a baby figuring out the world. I held you every single day. I taught you your first words, but I know you can't remember any of that." "And then," she went on, her voice maintaining that steady, chilling composure, "by the time you were old enough to really understand, you had already made your choice. You decided I wasn't the kind of mother you wanted. And even though you were just a child who couldn't have known better, the way my heart fractured that day was very, very real. For the next 6 years, I existed as a ghost in your life. I knew nothing about your classes, your friends, or even your favorite color. So, you see, I don't really have any standing to judge you or the life you have now. But I am going to give you one piece of advice today," Brandon recalled her saying, her tone shifting, growing heavy with a terrible sense of finality. "And it's probably the last thing I'll ever be able to teach you. You have to own your choices and your words. Insisting you were just a child isn't a magical eraser. It doesn't grant you automatic forgiveness." The moment those words left her mouth, Brandon told me he heard a raw, desperate sob tear out of Eric's small chest, a sound that echoed the breaking of his own heart. "Mom, I know I was wrong. Please don't leave. Please, Mom, don't leave me." For just a split second, Brandon saw her composure crack, her shoulders tensing as if bracing for a physical impact. But she never stopped walking toward the door. He knew what the outside world would call her: cold, unnatural. But what she was doing, in her own mind, was balancing the scales. Eric would stay with him, receive an education that only their kind of wealth could buy. And he would never for a single moment question whether he was loved. The boy was, as Brandon reminded himself, the sole heir to the Walker family fortune. His starting line in life was a finish line most people could only ever dream of reaching. He had absolutely everything. And, yes, losing a mother. Brandon knew that would leave a permanent scar, a deep and jagged hole in his life. But for Eric to get his mother back, Stephanie would have had to kill the woman she had fought tooth and nail to become. And if Eric had been a child who truly, desperately needed her, Brandon told me this with a shattered look in his eyes, then maybe, just maybe, she would have been the one to light the match and burn her own future down. But he wasn't that child. And that, he understood now, was the devastating truth at the heart of this tragedy. Her past life, their empty marriage, her entire identity as a mother. It was all just wreckage she was walking away from. But in that moment, as he watched her leave their perfectly manicured lawn behind, he saw her, for the first time, become whole. Someone in this world had to love her without conditions, and if no one else was going to, she was finally going to do it for herself. And then, he swore to me, a small, genuine smile touched her lips as she stepped off their property, her body moving as if a tremendous physical weight had just been lifted from her soul. On the day she was scheduled to take her final flight back to Finland, Brandon drove to the airport. I had suggested it might be too painful, but he felt a compulsive, desperate need to see her one last time. He didn't harbor any illusion of asking for another chance. He just stood there, an anonymous figure in the bustling terminal, watching her until the silence between them became a physical weight. Finally, he broke it with a question that was really a confession. "Stephanie," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears, "if we could go back, I swear to you, I would cherish you. I would have actually loved you," he confessed, the words cracking under the immense pressure of his regret. "Instead of all of this, instead of only seeing what I had when it was already gone forever, I always took for granted that you'd be there. It never even occurred to me that I was making you miserable. Stephanie, I am so, so profoundly sorry." She didn't answer right away, her eyes fixed on the flickering departure screen above their heads. "You saw me off the last time, too," she said, her voice quiet. "We just never managed to have a real goodbye." "Brandon," she said, at last turning to look him in the eye, "let's do it properly this time. A real goodbye." That one word, he told me, goodbye, was the blow that finally brought him to his knees. He felt a muscle in his cheek begin to twitch uncontrollably as a tidal wave of pure, undiluted grief washed over him. "Can't we?" His lips were trembling too hard to finish the sentence. And then, Stephanie, in a gesture that felt both impossible and deeply kind, opened her arms. "Don't be so heartbroken," she said softly. "We were in each other's lives for a decade. Just think of me as an old friend who knows you better than anyone else on the planet. So, let's just have a hug." Before she could even finish the sentence, he was collapsing into her embrace. She smelled of pine and crisp winter air, and he clung to her with a desperate, crushing strength, his arms like steel bands as if he could physically keep her from leaving. In all their years of marriage, he realized with a jolt, they had almost never been this close. A simple hug, holding hands, a conversation that wasn't a minefield of unspoken resentments. These were the small, simple acts of affection Brandon now knew she had been starving for. Things she had practically begged him for over the years. Things he had been too arrogant and emotionally blind to give her. And now, at the precise moment she was completely and irrevocably over him, he was here, offering it all like a fool's gold. He felt her sigh against his chest and pat his back gently, the way you would soothe a crying child. He knew she could feel the violent tremors running through his entire body. "Eric," she said, her voice strained from the force of his grip. "Please, just take good care of him. And if you ever find someone new, build a real family this time. Just be good to her, okay?" Brandon could only shake his head against her shoulder, pulling her even tighter. He couldn't stop it. A single, hot tear escaped and fell onto her neck. It was insane, he told me, how fate had such a twisted, cruel sense of humor. He never understood that she thought he was completely numb to her, which is precisely why she had found the strength to leave him. In her world, walking away was an act of mercy. She believed she was setting them all free, herself, to finally live the life she was meant for. Brandon, to find a woman he could actually connect with, and their son, Eric, to have the kind of mother he had always wanted. The thought that it was all a catastrophic, heartbreaking misunderstanding never once occurred to her. She couldn't possibly have known that for Brandon. Her absence was a wound that would never, ever heal. The single greatest regret of a life that suddenly felt hollowed out and meaningless. He finally confessed it to her in a broken whisper, his breath warm against her ear, his voice frayed with a decade of unspoken pain. It is destroying me that I never once held you close like this before. For a brief, agonizing moment, he felt the muscles in her back tense, a barely perceptible shudder. He thought he saw the shimmer of tears in her eyes before she blinked them away and offered a smile, one of pure, unburdened relief. Gently, she created a space between them, stepping out of his desperate embrace. That's all in the past now, Brandon. It doesn't mean anything anymore. We have to let it go. We have to move on. He instinctively caught her hand before she could pull it away completely, his gaze intense, searching her face for something that was no longer there. I I'm not finding someone new, Stephanie. And Eric will only ever have one mom. I know we broke something inside of you. And I know you can't forgive us for it. But Eric and I, he swore, his voice ringing with a conviction he hadn't felt in his entire life. We will wait for you. If you ever, ever want to see us, you just have to call. I don't care where I am in the world. I will bring him straight to you. Stephanie, for you, my door will always, always be open. And then, as if summoned by the sheer force of his desperate plea, a small figure darted out from behind a concrete pillar. It was Eric, his face a mess of red, swollen grief, crying out, "Mom, I was wrong. I'll wait for you. I'll wait for as long as it takes for you to be my mom again." Brandon watched, completely paralyzed, as Stephanie knelt down, and with a familiar gesture from a lifetime ago, she reached out and tenderly wiped the tears from their son's cheeks. "I am so sorry, Eric. I can't stay here with you and do all the things a mom is supposed to do, but I will always, always be your mother. Nothing and no one in this world can ever change that fact." Model. He told me her final words in that airport echoed in his head for months. "To be a good mother, Nathan," Stephanie had said, her voice quiet but with a terrifying certainty, her eyes meeting his. "I have to be my own person first." Just then, an announcement for a flight to Helsinki cut through the sterile air, the robotic voice sealing their fate. "Passengers for Finnair Flight AY52, please proceed to gate B12. Stephanie stood up, and in that one motion, the life they had built seemed to fracture. She ran her hand through their son Brandon's hair, a fleeting, tender gesture that felt like a painful memory even as it was happening. Then, her eyes found Nathan's for the last time. "Take him home." That was it. No long goodbye. She hoisted her bag onto her shoulder, turned away from the two of them, and simply walked into a future that didn't include him. Nathan remembered standing out on that passenger curb, watching her plane climb into the night sky until it was just another blinking light among the stars. He described it as the moment the anesthetic of shock finally wore off and the raw pain hit him. She was actually gone. It wasn't a fight. It was a finality. He held on to a fragile hope that maybe someday the deep, primal bond of family would pull them back together, but he knew, even then, that she had made a choice for herself. The future she was flying toward was a terrifying blank canvas. But for the first time since he'd known her, she was the only one holding the brush, painting a life entirely on her own terms.